The noise of a football crowd is a living thing. It rises like a tide. It breaks like a wave. And when you are young enough and brave enough to stand in the center of it, you feel immortal. Every player who has ever walked into a stadium knows the sensation. The moment when the world feels loud enough to drown out doubt and history seems to open its hands and prepare to carry you forward. Yet every player also learns that the most revealing moments in this sport do not arrive during the roar. They arrive in the silence after. I remember the first time I understood that silence. It was not the quiet of defeat or the hush of a crowd waiting for a final kick. It was the kind of silence that belongs to empty locker rooms and darkened tunnels. The kind of silence that tells you the game is temporary and the future is not promised. The kind of silence that would define an entire generation of football players who lived in a world that suddenly needed something more from them than touchdowns or championships. There was a time in American football when the greatest challenge a young athlete imagined was the challenge of survival on the field. Every hit, every snap, every second of a game built around calculated violence taught these men to believe in their own durability. But when the war clouds formed over Europe and the Pacific, the truth arrived in ways that no sound from any stadium could soften. Football was a game. War was a summons. And thousands of young men who believed their futures would be measured in yards and seasons soon learned that their lives would be measured in something far more unforgiving. The story of those years begins with a feeling. It's a feeling that everything ordinary was about to be rewritten. College stars who had spent their autumns dreaming of the draft found themselves reading newspapers that suddenly seemed heavier in their hands. Coaches who used to lecture about discipline and commitment started talking in quieter tones, as if they already sensed the horizon shifting. Families watched their sons walk out the door and wondered whether the next knock would bring news that no parents should ever hear. The stadiums still filled. The games still played. But beneath the surface, something irreversible was taking shape. There was a running back in the late 1930s who believed he was destined to become one of the greats. He had balance that seemed impossible and a kind of instinct that made defenders slip into the wrong angle before they even realized it. Reporters compared him to legends before he had even graduated. He signed with a professional team and prepared for a career that every young athlete in the country envied. Then came the spring morning when he folded his uniform, placed it inside a storage trunk, and stepped into a bus headed toward a military camp. He never returned to the field again. The last time anyone saw him in a stadium, he was walking through the stands as a spectator, staring at the turf with an expression that held equal parts pride and loss. There was another player, a lineman with a frame built for impact. Coaches said he had the kind of strength you cannot coach and a heart that made him impossible to intimidate. He was drafted into the league with expectations that grew heavier each year. But when he received his letters from the military, he made a choice that changed the arc of his life. He left the locker room without ceremony and joined a battalion that would later be sent into combat. The official reports said he never returned. His team kept his locker empty until the season ended. No one ever forgot the silence of that empty space. Not every player was lost forever. Some came back. But the men who returned were not always the same ones who had left. There was a quarterback who once played with a kind of grace that made people believe the ball was an extension of his arm. When the war broke out, he left like so many others. He served with courage. He returned with honor. But when he stepped back onto the field, something inside him had shifted. His teammates noticed it before anyone else. The pause before the snap. The distant look in his eyes when a receiver broke free. The hesitation that had never existed before. He played out his contract, finished his obligations, and then walked away from the game forever. He told a reporter years later that the war had taken something from him that football could never give back. These are only fragments of a much larger truth. A truth that stretches across rosters and stadiums and families. A truth that reaches into the heart of what American sports meant before the war and how completely they were reshaped by it. When the nation called, football players answered. Not because they wanted to be heroes, but because they believed they had no other choice. They were athletes, but they were also sons, brothers, fathers, and citizens. And when the world required sacrifice, they stepped forward with a conviction that continues to echo through history. Imagine a season where half your teammates are gone before training camp even begins. Imagine walking onto a field knowing that the men who once lined up beside you might already be halfway across the world. Imagine running drills while secretly wondering if the next letter delivered to the stadium office will hold someone's final message home. It is difficult to articulate the emotional weight those players carried. It is even more difficult to understand how the game continued when the country seemed to be unraveling. Football during wartime was not the same sport. It was a shadow of itself, held together by determination and necessity. Rosters were patched together with older players, teenagers, and men classified as unfit for service. Coaches faced moral dilemmas they had never imagined. Executives met in back rooms discussing whether the league could survive another month. But above all, there was a sense of suspended breath. A sense that the game was living in the space between what had been lost and what had not yet begun. As I reflect on that period, I cannot help but feel that football was robbed of something irreplaceable. The war took entire careers. It took potential that will never be measured. It took athletes who might have rewritten the record books. It took a generation that deserved its own golden age and replaced it with uncertainty and sacrifice. This documentary is about that theft. It is about how history reached into the heart of the sport and reshaped it in ways that still matter. It is about the players who gave everything to a country that needed them more than the game did. It is about the legacy they left behind. The silence after the crowd fades is more than an absence of sound. It is a reminder that glory is fragile and history is relentless. The men who lived through that era understood that reality with a clarity that few athletes ever face. They walked away from the field not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. The war reshaped their lives and reshaped the sport they loved. When I look back at the years when the world stood on the edge of transformation, I see football suspended inside a moment far larger than itself. Before the war, the sport was growing, maturing, and fighting for national relevance. It had stars who filled stadiums with anticipation and college programs that fed the league with talent year after year. Yet in the early 1940s, everything familiar about American football was pulled into a current that no one could escape. The world was changing at a speed that eclipsed the rhythm of the seasons. And the athletes who once dedicated their lives to the game suddenly found their identities colliding with the demands of a global conflict. That collision reshaped not just careers, but the entire identity of American sports. Nearly 1,000 NFL players, coaches, trainers, and staff would ultimately serve in World War II. Their names filled newspapers, enlistment rolls, and letters mailed from ports and battlefields. They came from every team in the league. They served in every branch of the military. Some were already established veterans of the sport whose absence left teams scrambling to maintain even a shadow of their former selves. Others were rookies who had been drafted by football teams only to be drafted again by the military. For countless college stars, the war arrived before their professional journeys ever began. They had been weeks or months away from chasing dreams that suddenly dissolved in the face of a far greater duty. In the years leading up to the war, football had finally begun to take hold in the American imagination. Stadiums were filling. Rivalries were intensifying. strategies had evolved to levels that commentators struggled to keep up with. The NFL was still young, still fragile, and still fighting for firm cultural ground. But it was moving toward a future filled with promise. College football was even more deeply woven into American life. It carried tradition, identity, and a sense of belonging for communities across the nation. But when the world descended into conflict, the sport became an afterthought for a country focused on survival. The NFL felt the shift almost immediately. Rosters that once seemed balanced and deep were suddenly hollowed out by enlistment. Coaches arrived at camp and discovered that the men they had spent years guiding were now preparing to wear uniforms of a different kind. As more and more players left, teams struggled to field competitive lineups. Several franchises faced the very real possibility of collapse. Decisions that would have been unthinkable in any other era became necessary within months. Teams merged to survive. Others brought in older players whose careers had been considered finished. Some relied on men who had been rejected from service for medical reasons. Football was clinging to life in a nation consumed by war. The Philadelphia Eagles and Pittsburgh Steelers famously combined into a single team for a season. It was a desperate measure born of necessity, and it revealed the strain placed on the league. Even with two rosters merged, the team barely held together. Other franchises found themselves on the brink of folding entirely. Owners debated whether the league should continue at all. With college talent drying up, scouting offered no relief. Many of the most promising young athletes in the country were now wearing military gear rather than pads, and no one knew when or if they would return. Sports writers of the era recorded the tension with a mixture of admiration, sorrow, and disbelief. They wrote about players signing enlistment papers with the same determination they once brought into the huddle. They wrote about quiet locker rooms where folded jerseys lay untouched. They wrote about teams that continued to play even when the season felt haunted by absence. One writer reflected that the league's survival depended on its ability to honor the players who had gone to war while still giving the public a thread of normalcy. It was a fragile balance, but it mattered. Wartime coaches spoke about the strange duality of their responsibilities. On one hand, they still had a job to do. They had a team to lead, a schedule to complete, and a sport to protect. On the other hand, they felt the weight of knowing that the men who once filled their depth charts were now marching across continents or sailing into hostile waters. One coach said the war forced him to see his players, not just as athletes, but as young men standing at the threshold of history. Another admitted that he could not prepare for games without thinking about the war reports printed in the morning papers. Every roster update felt like a reminder that football existed in the shadow of something far more profound. Military historians later observed that athletes brought a unique blend of toughness, discipline, and resilience to their service. Many performed their duties with distinction and courage. Some rose to positions of leadership. A few became legends for acts of bravery that surpassed anything they had ever accomplished on a field. Their stories echo through the decades not only because they were athletes, but because they were citizens who understood the weight of responsibility. They carried the values of the sport into the most difficult environments imaginable. And in doing so, they reshaped the narrative of what athletic identity meant during wartime. But the cost was immense. Every season of the war represented another year lost in the prime of an athlete's physical life. Football careers are short, even in the best circumstances. A few missed seasons can erase potential that might have defined the record books. A single injury in combat can end a career instantly. For some, the war took more than time or opportunity. It took their futures. Families buried sons who might have become stars. Teams honored players who would never return for training camp. The league learned to carry grief alongside determination, and the nation learned that sports were not immune to the realities of war. The transformation extended beyond the playing field. American sports culture itself shifted under the pressure of global conflict. Football became a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and unity. The sport that once represented ambition became a reflection of national character. Fans watched games not simply for entertainment, but as a reminder of life beyond the war. The athletes on the field carried the weight of those expectations even as they navigated rosters filled with temporary replacements and improvised strategies. The sport endured because it adapted. It survived because it spoke to something enduring within the American spirit. The sacrifices of these athletes form the foundation of this documentary. Their stories capture the emotional complexity of a generation caught between the pursuit of sport and the demands of history. The war altered who they were, who they could become, and what the sport itself would be in the decades ahead. To understand this transformation is to understand the heart of football's identity. This documentary will explore how the war erased entire paths, how it reshaped coaching philosophies, how it forced teams to innovate or collapse, and how it created a post-war football culture built on a deeper appreciation of toughness, duty, and legacy. Across the next 20 chapters, we will move through the full arc of that history. We will examine the fragile state of the league before the war. We will follow the first wave of players called to serve. We will look at college stars whose futures were rewritten before they ever reached the league. We will study the teams that nearly folded and those that found creative ways to survive. We will honor the players who served with courage and those who never returned. We will explore the physical and psychological transformations that shaped returning veterans. We will trace the sport's evolution through the war and into the era that followed. Every chapter will deepen the understanding of how football was reshaped by one of the most defining events in human history. The war did not simply interrupt football, it redirected its entire future. It changed the sport's mythology, its culture, and its soul. And as we step forward into the next chapter of this documentary, we begin by returning to the world of football as it existed before the storm. A world on the brink of an upheaval it could not yet see. I often think back to the NFL of the late 1930s, because in many ways it felt like the final quiet breath before a world reshaped itself. The league was still young, still fragile, still trying to convince America that professional football belonged in the same conversation as baseball and boxing. College football owned the nation's imagination. The pro game was the rougher cousin waiting at the edge of town, hoping one big moment would finally earn a seat at the table. When I picture that era, I see cold bleachers made of steel and concrete, small clusters of fans bundled against the wind, players whose uniforms hung loose on their frames because they were built for factory floors and warehouse shifts, not modern athletic facilities. Everything felt unpolished, experimental, unfinished. Nobody knew it then, but the league was standing at the edge of a global storm that would rip away its brightest talent and test whether professional football could endure at all. The owners who held the league together were hardly titans of industry. They were gamblers, idealists, or local businessmen who believed football could grow into something bigger but understood the margins were thin. A bad winter could erase ticket revenue. A star player could vanish into another job that paid an extra $5 a week. Travel was primitive. Teams rode trains through the night, sleeping in seats that barely reclined, waking up stiff and sore before walking straight into a stadium. The league was growing, but it was a growth held together by stubbornness rather than security. You could feel the fragility in every decision. Every rule change, every expansion discussion, every attempt to bring in new fans felt like a small bet placed with trembling hands. What people forget today is that the league's identity was still forming. The forward pass was no longer a novelty, but it had not yet fully transformed the game. Most offenses still ran through powerful backs who crashed through the line like battering rams. Defensive schemes were simple, often little more than organized pursuit. Helmets were made of leather. Face masks did not exist. The best players were defined by toughness and an iron will, not speed or specialization. When the New York Giants, Chicago Bears, and Washington Redskins battled for championships, they were doing so in an era where endurance was often more important than strategy. Every roster had players who worked 2 or 3 jobs to survive. Some worked as carpenters or machinists. Some coached high school teams in the offseason. The NFL's players certainly did not. They were too focused on the next game, the next paycheck, the next chance to prove that professional football deserved respect. Stadiums were filled with the sound of marching bands and paper programs snapping in the wind. Tailgates were modest gatherings, if they existed at all. The league was small enough that rivalries still felt personal. Coaches shouted instructions that echoed across half-empty grandstands. You could hear players breathing. You could hear the thud of bodies colliding without the roar of tens of thousands drowning it out. It was a league defined by intimacy, intensity, and ambition. Nobody imagined it was about to be reshaped entirely by a war that would pull young men from every corner of the country. The real vulnerability of the NFL was not its finances or its popularity. It was the youth of its players. The average player was in his 20s, strong, disciplined, and already accustomed to pushing through pain. Exactly the kind of men the military would soon target. Sports writers of the era had no sense of how much would be lost. They wrote about the growing stardom of Sammy Bowe in Washington, the powerful Giants teams under Steve Owen, the precision of the Bears under George Halas. They assumed these stories would continue. The league felt like it was finally finding its footing. The game was expanding beyond its small footprint in the Northeast and Midwest. There was talk of establishing stronger national appeal. There was a sense of momentum, as if the league had finally stepped out from the shadow of college football and begun to assert its own presence. But beneath that optimism ran a quiet tension. The first peacetime draft in American history arrived in 1940. A clear sign that the country sensed what was coming. Teams read the news and hoped the storm would not reach them. Coaches tried not to think about which of their players might be called away. Some teams pretended nothing was happening at all. Others whispered about contingency plans, wondering how they would field competitive rosters if their stars disappeared. The specter of war was like a slow-moving tide. It did not yet reach the shoreline, but everyone could see it rising. What made the NFL uniquely exposed was the absence of depth. Rosters were small, and talent was concentrated. Losing one star could shift the balance of an entire division. Losing several could collapse a franchise. Owners knew this. Coaches knew this. Players tried not to think about it, but they felt it too. They felt it when they heard radio broadcasts about the fall of European cities. They felt it when newspapers printed casualty reports from overseas. They felt it when young men from their hometowns enlisted. The league tried to project confidence, but confidence was a thin shield against the momentum of world events. I often imagine what it must have been like inside those locker rooms in 1939 and 1940. The smell of leather gear drying after rain. The clatter of metal cleats against concrete floors. Players taping their own ankles because training staffs were small. Conversations drifting from football to politics without anyone quite knowing how to bridge the gap between them. A sense that life was moving faster than the sport they loved. The NFL was not ready for global conflict. It was not ready to lose its heroes. It was not ready to operate without the generation of young men whose competitive fire was beginning to ignite the league's next chapter. Yet part of what defined the players of that era was resilience. They had grown up during the Great Depression. They had learned to make do with little. They had walked into adulthood carrying the weight of scarcity and uncertainty. Football was their escape. Football was their chance to build something. That made the looming war feel even more tragic. Just when they were carving out a place for themselves, just when the league was stepping onto a larger national stage, the world prepared to claim them for a cause far bigger than sport. The NFL before the storm was a league on the brink of possibility. But possibility is fragile when history begins to accelerate. The players who stepped onto the field in those final pre-war seasons had no idea they would become the missing generation. The generation whose absence would change the league forever. When the storm finally arrived, it did more than interrupt a sport. It stole time, careers, lives, and momentum. And it marked the end of the NFL's innocence, replacing it with a harsher understanding of how deeply the world beyond the field can reshape the game within it. It happened slowly at first, so quietly that most people in the stands never saw the signs. A few received them at home, trying to hide the tremor in their hands as their wives or parents looked on. A roster move was supposed to be a transaction, a negotiation, or at worst, a disappointment. Now it was a summons to war. Coaches tried to be stoic, but the truth was written across their faces. Every departure felt like losing a limb. The NFL was built on chemistry and continuity. Teams were families long before the word became a marketing slogan. Seeing a teammate pack his gear into a duffel bag, knowing he might never return, was a wound that reached far deeper than any on-field collision. One of the earliest stars called to serve was a quiet fullback from the Midwest whose teammates swore he was strong enough to move a sled by himself. When he received his draft notice, he folded it slowly, tucked it into his locker, and kept practicing as if nothing had changed. After practice, he stood alone near the doorway, staring into the hallway where trainers pushed carts of equipment. A few players approached him, unsure what to say. They clapped him on the shoulder, offered brief words, then walked away with their throats tight. Moments like that played out across the league throughout 1940 and 1941. Nobody wanted to admit how much fear they were carrying, but it lived in every pause, every uncertain glance, every unfinished sentence. Teammates would huddle around, their eyes shifting between the departing player and the ground beneath their feet. There were no grand speeches. These were working men from an era that valued restraint. But the emotion in the room was always unmistakable. You could feel it vibrating beneath the surface. A player's departure was not just a personal sacrifice. It was the beginning of a wider unraveling that would soon spread across the entire league. The newspapers ran small articles about the first NFL players entering military service. The stories were respectful, patriotic, and often brief. Sports writers did not yet understand how many more names would follow. They wrote as though these first cases were exceptions. They were not. They were the opening notes of a long, relentless procession. Inside locker rooms, the atmosphere changed almost overnight. Equipment sat untouched. Jerseys hung limply on hooks. Taped ankles and bruised shoulders suddenly felt trivial. Coaches tried to run practices at full speed, but the weight of uncertainty slowed everything. Players still hit hard, still sprinted, still fought for roster spots, but their minds drifted. They wondered when their turn would come. Every time a trainer or assistant walked into the room carrying a stack of letters, conversations stopped. Every player looked up. Some felt relief when the names called were not theirs. Others felt guilt for feeling that relief. The emotional toll reached beyond the field. Wives, girlfriends, parents, and siblings filled the stands with a different kind of tension. They watched games with the knowledge that any moment could be a player's last appearance in uniform. Stadium cheers took on a bittersweet quality. Fans celebrated touchdowns, but the sound was layered with uncertainty. What did a win mean when the roster might be changed by war the next morning? As more players received their draft notices, a sense of collective vulnerability settled over the league. There was no strategy to plan for it. There was no playbook for losing your stars to war. Some teams tried to sign older players to fill the gaps. Others shifted positions, asking men to play roles they had never trained for. The league was improvising its way through a storm that had not yet reached full strength. These were not men stepping away because their bodies were tired or because their careers had reached their natural end. They were stepping into an entirely different kind of challenge. Others took one last walk across an empty stadium, running their hands along the railings, trying to memorize the place that had shaped them. Even the strongest players admitted the fear. They whispered it in confidence to teammates on long train rides. They confessed it under their breath in the quiet moments before bed. They worried about losing years of their careers. They worried more about not returning home at all. Football had taught them courage, but courage looks different when the opponent is war. The coaches who had spent years building their teams were forced to watch their rosters dissolve. Some tried to hide their frustration behind patriotism, but their disappointment was real. They believed the league was on the cusp of a new era. And now they had to face the possibility that the sport might not survive the upheaval. Veterans of the game felt a more personal sadness. They had seen young talent rise through the ranks, only to watch it disappear before its potential could fully bloom. But for all the sorrow and uncertainty, there was also a fierce sense of duty. Many players stepped forward with remarkable resolve. They believed that serving their country was not separate from their identity as athletes, but connected to it. They had been shaped by the discipline and sacrifice football demanded. Now they were being asked to channel those qualities into a mission that extended far beyond lines painted on a field. The earliest group of NFL players to enter military service became symbols of the league's resilience. Their departures marked a threshold that could not be crossed in reverse. Once they stepped away, nothing would ever be the same. Their empty lockers stood like silent testaments to the shifting world beyond the stadium walls. Each absence left a space that could not be filled by strategy or substitutions. It was a reminder that the league's fate was tied to the nation's fate, and the two would now move forward together through uncertainty, sacrifice, and transformation. As the war gathered momentum, as more players received their summons and more teams surrendered their stars, those first departures remained the emotional watershed. They taught every player, still wearing a uniform, that time on the field was fragile, temporary, and precious. They taught the league that survival would require adaptation. And they showed the nation that the NFL's greatest generation would be asked to fight, long before they were allowed to compete. I often think about the players we never got to see. Not the ones whose careers ended early, not the ones who suffered injuries in preseason exhibitions or faded into obscurity after a season or two, but the young men who carried entire college programs on their shoulders and then disappeared from football altogether. Before the world plunged into conflict, the college game was filled with future stars who seemed destined for the NFL. They were the heirs to the sport's next era. The men who would have reshaped strategy, redefined positional play, and built rivalries that might have lasted for decades. Instead, their names were lost to the war's gravity. Their stories scattered in old newspapers and military records rather than in highlight reels or championship banners. College football in the early 1940s was a vibrant and emotional landscape. Stadiums across the country were full every Saturday. Students lined the railings. Bands practiced until long after dark. Many of the athletes who led those programs were already being scouted by professional teams. Some had standing invitations to training camps. Others had received handwritten letters from coaches praising their instincts or their toughness. It was a pipeline that had only just begun to solidify, a fragile connection between college stardom and professional opportunity. But when the war escalated, that connection broke almost immediately. The first cracks appeared even before the United States officially entered the conflict. Military training programs expanded across universities. Young men were encouraged and eventually required to register for service. Coaches felt the shift long before administrators acknowledged it. They saw fewer students coming out for spring practice. They saw their best players spending time in military drills rather than film rooms. They saw the draft approaching, and with it, the realization that their brightest prospects might never play another down. There were quarterbacks whose leadership seemed effortless. They orchestrated offenses with precision, scanning the field with a calm intelligence that drew admiration even from rivals. Some had set conference passing records. Others had engineered remarkable comebacks in hostile stadiums. They were the kind of quarterbacks who would have shaped the way professional offenses evolved over the next decade. But war has no regard for athletic promise. Many of them never played another game after receiving their induction orders. A few returned years later, older and changed by what they had seen. Their athletic prime gone forever. Running backs were hit just as hard. The early 1940s produced some of the most electrifying collegiate runners the game had seen. They were fast, powerful, and fearless. Their legs powered entire programs, and their names filled headlines week after week. One in particular was known for breaking tackles with the stubborn determination of a man running toward destiny. Professional scouts described him as a sure future star. When he enlisted, the newspaper that had spent 3 seasons praising him printed a short farewell line. Barely 2 sentences long. It said he had left campus to answer his country's call. There was no mention of the fact that he had led his team in rushing for 3 straight years, or that he had been projected as a top professional prospect. His football identity vanished in a single paragraph. Linemen, too, disappeared at an alarming rate. They were often overlooked in headlines, overshadowed by the glamour of quarterbacks and skill positions, yet they formed the backbone of the college game. Many of the era's dominant linemen were preparing for professional careers. They had the size, the technique, and the relentless mentality that coaches loved. They were the kind of men who controlled the tempo of a game simply by refusing to be moved. But the war needed men who could carry heavy packs, operate machinery, and stand firm under pressure. Many linemen fit that description perfectly. They were recruited quickly and deployed even faster. Losing them changed everything. It appended strategies, forced coaches to rebuild lines with inexperienced underclassmen, and shifted the entire competitive balance of college football. What makes this loss even more profound is how sudden it felt. One season a player would stand at the center of a packed stadium, helmet under his arm, smiling as the crowd roared his name. The next season he was gone, replaced by a teammate who was younger, smaller, and wholly unprepared. Fans tried to adjust. Students tried to carry on the traditions, but the absence of those missing players created a silence that no cheering could fill. Everyone understood that something precious had been taken from the game, something that statistics and records could not fully capture. There were debates at the time about whether college football should continue at all. Some critics argued that the sport was a distraction from the national emergency. Others believed it was essential for morale. University presidents and military officials negotiated compromises. They allowed certain programs to continue, but under strict conditions. Rosters shrank. Training schedules changed. Many teams were forced to combine with military units on campus to field enough players for a season. The result was a patchwork version of the sport, one that lacked continuity and identity. It was football, but not the football that had produced the future stars now disappearing into military life. Scouts from the NFL tried to keep track of the young men whose careers had been interrupted. They clipped newspaper articles, wrote letters to families, and followed military bulletins. They hoped that some of the players would return in time to salvage their athletic futures. For a few, that hope became reality. But for most, the war redirected the entire course of their lives. Some never returned home. Others returned with injuries that ended any possibility of playing again. A few simply chose a different path after witnessing the harsh truths of combat. Football, once the center of their world, no longer held the same meaning. As I reflect on this lost generation, I recognize how much the sport changed because of their absence. The NFL that emerged after the war was different from the league that had existed before it. Strategies evolved. Coaching philosophies shifted. Teams adjusted to a talent pool that had been forever altered. The players who might have dominated the league in the late 1940s or early 1950s were gone, replaced by men who stepped into opportunities created by the vacuum left behind. Many of those post-war players became legends. They earned every accolade, but their rise was shaped by the absence of rivals who never got the chance to compete. In the quiet moments, when I think about the history of football, I always return to the young men who filled college stadiums with brilliance and promise. I picture the quarterbacks with easy confidence, the running backs who carried the hopes of their schools, and the linemen whose strength kept everything in motion. They should have been household names. They should have filled the early rosters of a growing NFL. They should have created storylines that would be retold for generations. Instead, their stories were interrupted, redirected into service records, medals, letters, home, and memories carried by the families they left behind. College football lost more than players during the war. It lost a generation of potential. It lost the natural progression of talent from campus to professional fields. It lost the continuity that helps a sport build its mythology. The young men who vanished from the game were not forgotten, but they were overshadowed by the enormity of the conflict that claimed their futures. They were the heirs of a football era that never arrived, the missing link between the sport's early years and the modern age that followed. I think about how different the NFL might be today if even a fraction of those players had reached the league. Their style, their toughness, their innovation could have reshaped entire decades of football history. Instead, the sport had to adapt without them. It had to rebuild, reinvent itself, and move forward while carrying the weight of what was lost. Their absence is not a footnote. It is a turning point. And it is one of the most important reasons the story of football during the war years cannot be told without acknowledging the players who never made it to the professional field. They remind us that history is shaped not only by the men who became legends, but also by those who should have. It was a moment when the league, still fragile and searching for stability, found itself staring into the possibility that professional football might not survive the greatest conflict the world had ever known. When the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, the league was already dealing with depleted rosters and mounting anxiety. Players were entering military service at a pace that accelerated with every passing week. Coaches were trying to plan for seasons with no clear understanding of who would still be available. Owners were studying financial ledgers that looked increasingly bleak. The NFL had never been built for crisis. It had been built on hope, bravado, and a belief that the sport's popularity would grow if it could just endure long enough. But war reshaped every assumption. Entire organizations were suddenly vulnerable to forces far beyond their control. Politicians, journalists, educators, and military officials weighed in. Some argued that football was a vital source of morale for a nation preparing for total war. Others saw it as a distraction and a misuse of young athletic talent that could be serving in uniform. The league waited for guidance, clinging to the possibility that someone in power would understand that shutting down the NFL would not strengthen the country. It would only strip away something that gave people a sense of normalcy during a time when normalcy was evaporating. Then came the letter that changed everything. President Franklin Roosevelt sent a response to the Commissioner of Baseball expressing his belief that sports should continue for the good of national spirit. It later became known as the Sports Must Go On letter. Although the letter was directed at baseball, the NFL studied every word of it. They clung to it as a lifeline. If the president believed that sports could serve the nation rather than hinder it, then perhaps professional football still had a chance to survive. The relief was real, but it did not eliminate the panic inside the league. The NFL did not have the financial cushion that baseball enjoyed. Its teams were smaller. Its fan base was loyal, but not yet large enough to guarantee survival through wartime restrictions. Some teams were hit so hard by player shortages that their very existence came into question. The Cleveland Rams suspended operations for the entire 1943 season because they could not field a competitive roster. The Pittsburgh franchise faced similar difficulties, and so did Philadelphia. The idea of losing multiple teams was not just a financial concern, it was a structural threat. The league needed stability to function. If too many teams folded, the schedule would collapse. The standings would be meaningless, and the NFL's credibility would vanish. That was when the league made one of the most unusual decisions in its history. In an attempt to keep the sport alive, it approved the temporary merger of teams that could not survive on their own. The most famous of these combinations was the Pittsburgh and Philadelphia merger, a one-season union that fans jokingly referred to with a name created by blending the teams together. The players came from different cities, different systems, and different philosophies. They were thrown together with little time to build chemistry. But they played because the alternative was silence. The merger was not a strategy to create a great team. It was a desperate move to preserve the league's existence. A similar arrangement was approved later when Pittsburgh again needed help, this time combining with the Chicago Cardinals. That team struggled even more, finishing the season without a single win. Their record was not the point. Participation was. Every game they played was another small victory in the fight to keep the NFL alive during the most unstable years the sport had ever faced. Inside league offices, conversations were tense and often emotional. Owners debated whether continuing the season was responsible or reckless. Coaches argued that they could compete with any roster they were given as long as the league remained intact. Some front office staff members worked long hours drafting contingency plans in case another team folded, or if the government imposed stricter restrictions. There were moments when even the most committed leaders of the sport admitted privately that the NFL might be steps away from shutting down entirely. Players felt that pressure as well. The ones who had not yet been drafted or enlisted were trying to hold on to both their careers and their sanity. They trained with teammates who might not be present the next week. They played games knowing that attendance could drop without warning. They lived under a cloud of uncertainty that grew heavier with every military announcement. Many of them knew that their time in football was temporary and that their eventual deployment was inevitable. Yet they lined up every Sunday and played with a sense of purpose that transcended wins and losses. There was one moment that has always stayed with me. A team executive recalled walking into an almost empty stadium hours before kickoff and feeling the echo of his own footsteps as a reminder of how fragile everything had become. He looked at the field and wondered if this was the last time he would see it prepared for a professional game. Despite the hardships, the NFL pressed forward. The games continued because the fans needed them. Crowds were smaller in some cities and surprisingly large in others, depending on the local mood and the number of young men who had already gone off to serve. Radio broadcasts became more important than ever as families gathered around to listen together. But the NFL survived the most dangerous years of the war. It survived the shortages, the mergers, the suspensions, and the emotional strain. It survived because the people inside the league believed that the sport mattered, not only to them, but to the country as a whole. When I think of that era, I do not think of standings or statistics. I think of the men in offices filled with uncertainty. I think of the players dressing for games while carrying the weight of an unknown future. I think of the moment when professional football hovered on the edge of darkness and refused to disappear. The league emerged battered but intact, and that resilience became one of the most important chapters in its history. In the autumn of 1943, the NFL faced a problem that no strategy meeting could solve. Player shortages had reached a point where two teams from Pennsylvania were forced into a solution that was as unprecedented as it was controversial. The Pittsburgh Steelers and the Philadelphia Eagles agreed to merge for a single season. The result was a team that would later be remembered as the Steagles. It was a temporary union born of desperation, an experiment in survival rather than ambition. Yet it became a defining moment, not only for the league, but for the men who had to navigate the impossible challenge of playing together under conditions that were anything but ideal. From the very first practice, the difficulties were clear. Players came from different systems, different coaching philosophies, and different cultures within their own locker rooms. Eagles linemen were used to a precise, disciplined offense, while Steelers backs were trained to improvise and hit gaps with instinct rather than structure. Coaches argued over which plays to call and which formations to prioritize. Players argued over positions. Some refused to switch roles. Others struggled simply to understand their teammates' tendencies. It was chaos disguised as a football team, and yet there was no alternative. If they failed, the league itself could falter further. The logistics were brutal. The team had to split practice time between two cities 40 miles apart. Travel on wartime trains was complicated by rationing and military priorities. Players often arrived exhausted from long journeys with little time to rest before practice or games. Equipment was limited. Uniforms from each original team were patched together haphazardly. Helmets, pads, and shoes were shared when necessary. What emerged on the field looked less like a polished professional team and more like a makeshift army, assembled with what resources were at hand. Yet the players approached it with a sense of duty that transcended frustration. They understood that every game mattered, not just for their careers, but for the morale of a country still at war. The chemistry problems were nearly insurmountable. Quarterbacks had to memorize multiple playbooks. Receivers learned new routes. Offensive and defensive linemen had to adjust to unfamiliar teammates with different stances and timing. Mistakes were frequent and glaring. Fans noticed them. Sports writers criticized them. The narrative around the Steagles often framed them as doomed before they even played a snap. Yet there was resilience hidden beneath the public perception. The players showed remarkable adaptability, relying on instinct, intelligence, and trust in one another to compensate for the lack of cohesion. They became a team in spite of themselves, not because everything fit neatly into place. There were moments of drama that defined the season. A running back who had spent most of his career in Philadelphia suddenly found himself paired with a lineman from Pittsburgh he barely knew. A handoff went awry, the ball bouncing free, And yet somehow, through a combination of luck and raw effort, the play resulted in a touchdown. On another occasion, a defensive back intercepted a pass intended for his former teammate. Rather than celebrate, he helped up the opponent and patted him on the back. These small acts of cooperation and mutual respect became the glue holding the team together. Moments of unlikely heroism amid the chaos. The coaching staff had to invent new strategies on the fly. They could not rely on established routines or trusted alignments. Each week brought a new challenge: injuries, absences, and unexpected travel delays. Coaches spent hours studying the opposition while simultaneously figuring out how to merge two disparate squads into a coherent unit. They debated endlessly about who would start, how to rotate positions, and how to maintain morale. Leadership had to be constant, compassionate, and adaptable. Every decision carried higher stakes than usual because failure would not only harm the team but threaten the fragile continuity of professional football itself. Off the field, the situation was no less complicated. Players lived in temporary housing near the training sites. They shared meals, schedules, and even laundry facilities. Privacy was scarce. Tensions sometimes erupted in arguments over who deserved what equipment, who had trained harder, or who should take precedence in team strategy. But just as frequently, there were moments of camaraderie that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Men who had been rivals for years learned to support one another, forging bonds born of necessity, but strengthened by the extraordinary conditions of wartime life. Public reaction was mixed. Fans in Pittsburgh resented the union, fearing that their team had been diluted and their local pride compromised. Fans in Philadelphia worried that their roster had been weakened. Newspapers published editorials questioning the legitimacy of a team that combined two franchises. Critics argued that the Steagles were a novelty rather than a serious contender. Yet, as the season progressed, it became clear that the players were giving their all. Wins and losses mattered, but survival and perseverance were more important. Every game played was a statement that professional football could endure even under the harshest circumstances. By the middle of the season, the Steagles began to find their rhythm. Plays that had once looked disjointed began to click. Individual strengths complemented one another. Quarterbacks learned which linemen could create space. Running backs understood which receivers would be where at the right time, and defensive rotations started functioning smoothly. It was not perfection. There were still errors, still frustrations, but it was football performed under the pressure of war and scarcity, and somehow it became meaningful in a way that transcended normal competition. The human stories embedded in the Steagles season are what endure. There was the young back who wrote to his mother daily, sharing small triumphs and setbacks, revealing the fear he felt about what might come next.
Hey.
And expressing gratitude for teammates who had become like brothers in a matter of weeks. There was the lineman who had never spoken to one of his Philadelphia counterparts in his life, yet found himself protecting him at all costs, covering his blind side in ways that transcended ego or personal gain. There were moments when fans would later recall how the players smiled, how they shook hands after a particularly grueling game, and how the camaraderie somehow reflected a larger American struggle, the ability to unite despite difference and adversity. The season ended with a record that would not be remembered for championship glory, but the achievement was in survival itself. The Steagles had competed, adapted, and endured. They had demonstrated that football could continue, even in the shadow of a global conflict that claimed young men by the hundreds. They had created a blueprint for resilience, improvisation, and teamwork under conditions that would test any professional organization to its limits. Their legacy is not statistical. It is emotional, structural, and moral. It is proof that the league could navigate the challenges of war without losing its identity. Looking back, the Steagles Experiment reveals the fragility and ingenuity of the NFL during its wartime struggle. It shows how far the league was willing to go to keep the sport alive. It shows the extraordinary lengths players and coaches were forced to traverse, both physically and psychologically. And it shows that even amid chaos, human courage and collaboration can transform desperation into achievement. The Steagles remain a testament not to winning or losing, but to the power of perseverance and unity in the face of unprecedented challenge. It is difficult to describe the moment when a man who had spent his life preparing for collisions on the football field suddenly found himself preparing for the chaos of war. One season, he was measuring angles on the chalk lines, calculating defensive reads, visualizing the perfect spin move to evade a tackle. The next season, he was learning to march, to load a rifle, to endure exhaustion that no practice drill could simulate. The transition was abrupt, violent, and disorienting. Coaches and teammates hugged them goodbye, often without fully expressing the depth of emotion they felt. Families clung to letters, hoping the young men they had watched grow into formidable athletes could survive the unpredictability of battle. For the players themselves, there was no room for hesitation. Football had instilled discipline, resilience, and a willingness to endure pain. But nothing in their previous lives could prepare them for the reality of being drafted into the armed forces. Boot camps replaced training camps. The morning wake-up call no longer came with whistles or padded walls, but with a harsh bark of drill sergeants. Meals were no longer celebratory team traditions or pre-game rituals, but quick, mechanical intakes of food designed to sustain energy. The focus shifted from finesse and playbooks to endurance, marksmanship, and following orders with precision. For the first time, players had to accept that failure could cost not only their positions, but their lives. The rules were absolute, and there was no room for improvisation or error. The violent shift was jarring for players who had grown accustomed to the structure and predictability of the game. Football had always been a controlled chaos. Plays were rehearsed. Equipment was designed to mitigate injury. Strategy was deliberate. Combat was the opposite. There were no referees, no regulations protecting the weak or the injured, no room for error. The physicality that had once been a source of pride now became a shadow of the intensity they would soon face in battle. Many reflected on the irony of it, noting how their bodies were trained to absorb impact, yet were entirely unprepared for the dangers of grenades, bullets, and artillery. The psychological impact was equally profound. Players had to rewire their instincts overnight. The same reactions that had allowed them to evade defenders or read opposing offenses were suddenly irrelevant. They had to suppress individual ambition, replace it with the collective mission, and internalize a discipline that was more rigid and unforgiving than any football play. Some described the early days of military life as a period of shock, where exhaustion, fear, and adrenaline combined to create a sense of unreality. They were still athletes at heart, but their minds were being forged into soldiers, and the transformation was as taxing as it was necessary. Many players carried the memory of the field into the barracks. They compared drills to scrimmages, formations to squad movements, and the intensity of practice to the rigor of obstacle courses. There were moments when camaraderie on the football field provided a psychological bridge to camaraderie in the military. Former teammates discovered that the trust built through football was now a foundation for survival. They learned to rely on one another in ways that went beyond the game. The bond formed through shared hardship and training became the bedrock of resilience, shaping men who would face the most dangerous theaters of the war together. Letters from players described the sense of dislocation. One quarterback wrote that he had never imagined himself dodging bullets instead of linebackers. A running back confessed that the mental discipline required in football had been invaluable, yet insufficient for what awaited. They spoke of fear in ways that were intimate and unspoken, a vulnerability that contrasted sharply with the bravado they displayed on the field. It was an emotional transition as much as a physical one. They were learning to navigate the internal battles of courage, anxiety, and mortality before even encountering the external battles that would follow. Some players found solace in small routines that echoed their football lives. Push-ups, sprints, and drills became familiar markers, anchors of identity in an environment designed to strip individuality. Leaders emerged naturally among former captains and veterans of the game. They adapted their command skills from huddles and practice sessions to platoons and squads. Their presence provided stability and direction for younger recruits, a reminder that discipline, leadership, and the ability to remain calm under pressure transcended the confines of a stadium. Despite the valor and adaptation, the transition left permanent scars. Many players reported physical injuries from military training that had no equivalent in football. Sprains, fractures, and fatigue accumulated in ways that their previous conditioning had not prepared them for. Psychological stress mounted as well. Sleep deprivation, the constant presence of authority figures, and the relentless repetition of drills produced anxiety that would follow some for the rest of their lives. Football had demanded toughness, but the war demanded an entirely different endurance, one that required suppressing personal ambition and confronting mortality on a daily basis. It is impossible to quantify the number of players who left the NFL only to step directly into military service, but historians estimate that hundreds of professional and collegiate athletes made the transition during the early years of the war. Each story is unique, yet each carries a common thread of abrupt transformation, emotional strain, and the confrontation of extreme responsibility. They were no longer just men who played for trophies, glory, or fan admiration. They were men tasked with the survival of others, tasked with missions that extended far beyond the comfort of the field. Players often reflected on the contrast between the gridiron and the battlefield. Football had always been controlled aggression, a game with rules designed to protect participants, a space where physicality could be celebrated without existential risk. War had no referee, no rule book that protected the vulnerable, no guarantee of survival. Some describe the shock of realizing that the instincts honed for competitive play had to be reshaped for unpredictability, that their bodies were no longer measured in yards or scores, but in survival and endurance. Yet there was also a sense of purpose. Many players embraced the transition with a conviction that mirrored their commitment to the sport. They understood that the country was at war, that the stakes were greater than any game, and that the qualities that had made them athletes, discipline, courage, teamwork, resilience, were precisely the qualities required to serve. There was pride in being called upon, a recognition that their personal ambitions were part of a larger narrative of sacrifice. The football field had taught them how to face pressure, but the battlefield demanded mastery of pressure on a scale that was terrifying and transformative. In reflection, the stories of these men illustrate one of the most profound shifts in sports history. The NFL was hollowed out for a time because its players became soldiers. The physical and psychological demands of war replaced the regimented chaos of football with a new order, harsher and more absolute. There is a strange gravity that surrounds the names Jack Lummis and Al Blozes. On the field, they were extraordinary athletes, men who could dominate a game with intelligence, strength, and instinct. But their legacies are not measured in touchdowns, sacks, or tackles. Their greatness was forged in a different arena, one defined not by fans or trophies, but by courage, sacrifice, and moments that demanded the absolute best of human character. These are stories of NFL players who became legends, not for the games they played, but for the lives they gave and the valor they displayed in a war that spared no one. Jack Lummis played college football at Texas A&M and then joined the New York Giants as a promising end. On the field, he was known for his explosive speed and instinctive understanding of space. His coaches marveled at his ability to read a play before it fully developed and to react with both aggression and precision. Fans anticipated a long and brilliant career in the NFL. Lummis had talent that seemed destined to etch his name into professional history. Yet, in 1941, with the world at war and America drawn into the conflict, he left the gridiron to serve his country. His transition from athlete to soldier would redefine the meaning of heroism. Lummis's service in the Pacific Theater during World War II placed him in the crucible of some of the fiercest combat of the conflict. He became a Marine, trained for amphibious assaults and jungle warfare, and was eventually assigned to the landing at Iwo Jima. For his actions, he received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Al Blozes is another name that resonates in both football and military history. A giant of a man, standing 6'6" and weighing over 260 pounds, Blozes played tackle at Georgetown and became a dominant force in the NFL with the New York Giants. His strength and athleticism were legendary. Scouts and coaches praised his explosiveness and intelligence, predicting a career that could have redefined defensive play for years. But in 1942, he volunteered for military service, determined to serve despite the cost to his professional aspirations. Blozes' journey led him to Europe, where he was assigned to the 16th Infantry Regiment in France. His actions during the conflict demonstrated an instinct for leadership and bravery that seemed to mirror his approach on the football field. Witnesses recounted how he repeatedly placed himself in harm's way to protect fellow soldiers. He carried wounded men from the battlefield, engaged enemy positions under fire, and refused to abandon his unit despite the imminent danger to his own life. Blozes was killed in action during an advance in 1945. His death was mourned by teammates, opponents, and fans who understood that the NFL had lost not only a remarkable player, but a man whose character transcended sport. These stories were not anomalies. Across the league, numerous players displayed similar courage. Some received formal recognition, while others were remembered only by comrades and family members. The narrative of the athlete-soldier became a defining motif of the wartime NFL. It reinforced the idea that professional football had produced not merely entertainers, but individuals capable of extraordinary feats under unimaginable pressure. The gridiron had prepared them, in ways subtle but profound, for the chaos, discipline, and endurance demanded by war. The psychological transition from player to combatant is as remarkable as the acts themselves. Men accustomed to structured competition and defined rules were now navigating environments where improvisation and immediate life-or-death decisions became routine. Football had taught them teamwork, anticipation, and resilience. War demanded that they translate those lessons into strategy, courage, and relentless determination in a setting where failure carried the ultimate cost. For Lummis, Blozes, and others, the line between athletic excellence and human valor blurred, creating a legacy that could never be measured in wins or losses. The impact of their actions reverberated through the league. When surviving players returned after the war, they carried with them the experience of combat, a perspective that altered locker room culture, team dynamics, and approaches to the game itself. The war had removed a generation of talent from the field, but it also imprinted a sense of discipline, purpose, and emotional depth on the league's remaining players. Those who survived returned to a league transformed, both by the absence of those who had fallen and by the extraordinary experiences of those who had seen what true courage demanded. The humility of these men, their refusal to equate athletic fame with the gravity of life and death, underscores the moral dimension of their legacy. Football had given them fame and a platform, but war demanded a higher standard, and they met it with grace, fearlessness, and sacrifice. Historians often reflect on the duality of this generation. These men were both athletes and citizens, entertainers and warriors. Their careers were paused, redirected, and in many cases, ended. But their lives became legend, not for what they achieved on the field, but for what they accomplished when the stakes were far higher than any professional contest. Their stories challenge the way we measure greatness. We are accustomed to thinking of NFL legends in terms of statistics, championships, or Hall of Fame induction. But Lummis, Blosies, and others remind us that true greatness often emerges in moments where there is no audience, no applause, and no guarantee of survival. We cannot consider the NFL of the 1940s without acknowledging the absence of men who would have been dominant stars. We cannot understand the evolution of the game without considering how the war forced innovation, adaptability, and resilience among those who remained. The heroism of Lummis, Blosies, and others is not merely anecdotal. It is part of the structural and emotional fabric of the league, a testament to the extraordinary character of the men who wore the uniform of both football and country. These stories endure because they speak to the essence of human courage. In the end, the Medal of Honor stories from this era teach us about resilience, responsibility, and the capacity to rise above circumstance. They remind us that sport and war, though seemingly distant, are connected through the human qualities they demand: discipline, courage, teamwork, and a willingness to sacrifice for something greater than oneself. These players left the gridiron and entered history in ways that no championship, statistic, or trophy could ever capture. Their legacy is permanent, woven into both the annals of football and the history of a nation tested by the extremes of global conflict. There is a silence that lingers in the memory of a team after one of its own does not return. It is not the quiet of an empty stadium or the hush after a play. It is a quiet, rooted in absence, in the knowledge that a man who once carried both talent and camaraderie is gone forever. During World War II, that silence became familiar to the NFL. Names like Jack Lummis and Al Blozes were remembered for heroism, but there were hundreds of others who never came back to the field. Men whose lives ended in jungles, deserts, and battlefields far from the stadiums they had once dominated. Their loss was more than personal. It reshaped teams, communities, and the league itself. The stories of these players are difficult to recount without feeling the weight of history pressing in. Each man had a life, a career, a future that was interrupted abruptly. Some were rising stars, already making a mark on their teams and on fans. Others were young prospects, brimming with potential but yet to prove themselves fully on the professional stage. All of them answered the call of duty, leaving behind locker rooms, teammates, coaches, and fans who understood that the cost of patriotism was often higher than anyone could anticipate. Consider the case of young Bussy, a quarterback for the Chicago Bears. He had a promising career ahead of him. A man whose understanding of the game and precision passing had earned him respect in the locker room. When the draft called, he left the team, exchanging playbooks for field manuals and football cleats for combat boots. Bussy was killed in the European theater, and the news of his death reached his team months later. The Bears mourned privately, but the silence in the locker room spoke louder than any tribute. Each teammate understood that they would never hear his voice on the sideline, never see his instincts execute a perfect play, never share in the small rituals that make a football season alive. These losses were not abstract statistics. They were deeply personal for the men who remained. Coaches struggled to fill positions, often turning to players who were younger, smaller, or less experienced. The rhythm of practice changed. Team chemistry was altered irrevocably. Veterans had to take on leadership roles prematurely. They carried not only their responsibilities on the field, but the memory of teammates who would never wear the uniform again. Every touchdown, tackle, and interception became tinged with the shadow of absence. The game itself felt smaller, somehow diminished, when measured against the magnitude of what had been lost. Teams created memorials and rituals to honor the men who did not return. Some named plays or formations after them. Others wore their initials on helmets or uniforms, while newspapers chronicled their lives and deaths, reminding fans that the cost of war extended beyond the front lines. In many cases, the players' contributions to the NFL were eclipsed by their service. Their athletic achievements became secondary, and yet they endured in memory precisely because of the sacrifice they made. The league learned, often painfully, that its history is intertwined with a larger national narrative, and that greatness can exist beyond statistics and accolades. One cannot overstate the emotional toll. Families received telegrams and letters that confirmed the worst. Teammates heard rumors that were then validated, leaving them to grapple with grief while still performing under the spotlight of public expectation. Coaches wrote of the difficulty of maintaining focus in practice, knowing that every play reminded the surviving players of their absent friends. The psychological burden was immense, but it also created a shared sense of purpose. Teams became tighter, bonded by the collective memory of those who had been lost. The league itself recognized, consciously or not, that honoring these men required both perseverance and excellence in play, a tribute enacted week after week on the field. It is essential to remember that the players who never returned represented more than talent lost. They were symbols of a generation whose potential was cut short. College stars who might have dominated the NFL for decades, linemen whose size and agility would have redefined the game. Backs whose speed and intelligence could have changed the outcomes of championships, all were swept away by global events that no team, no coach, and no league could influence. The absence of this generation reshaped professional football, forcing teams to improvise, strategies to evolve, and young men to rise to levels of responsibility they might never have imagined. Players who survived often reflected that their own careers were forever marked by the absence of their comrades. They spoke of the emotional burden of playing games and celebrating victories while remembering teammates who would never share in the joy. Some refused to seek personal glory, feeling that no achievement could fully honor the lives of those who had given theirs. Stories emerge from the surviving accounts that illustrate the human dimension of loss. One veteran described walking into an empty stadium for a practice session and pausing to remember a teammate who had been killed in action. He spoke of the way the field felt different, as if the absence was tangible, a presence in its own right. Another recounted a post-game locker room where silence replaced chatter, a recognition that one man who had always contributed a voice, a joke, a perspective, was gone forever. These are the details that statistics cannot capture, the emotional truths that define the human cost of war. The NFL also struggled with the practical implications of these losses. Teams had to recruit hastily from colleges and semi-professional leagues, creating uneven rosters and unpredictable performances. Some franchises faced financial strain, unable to field competitive squads without the talent they had lost. Fans adjusted expectations, understanding that victories and losses were now secondary to the broader narrative of survival and sacrifice. The league continued, but every snap carried the weight of memory. Every game a quiet acknowledgement of those who would never return. In reflecting on this era, it becomes clear that the most powerful legacy of the fallen players is not found in record books or highlight reels. It is found in the cultural memory of the league, in the way teams, coaches, and fans internalized loss and honored service. It is found in the understanding that the NFL is part of a larger historical and moral landscape, one in which the glory of sport is inseparable from the cost of human life and the reality of global conflict. Every play called, every tackle made, every touchdown celebrated during those years was shadowed by absence and sacrifice. The emotional resonance continues today, when historians recount the names of players who never returned. It is not merely to honor them, but to remind us that professional sports are never immune to the forces that shape the world. The NFL of the 1940s was defined by its talent, yes, but also by its losses. The men who did not return serve as a reminder of the fragility of human life, the unpredictability of global events, and the enduring power of memory. They are woven into the fabric of the league, not as statistics, but as enduring presences, shaping the ethos, culture, and emotional depth of professional football. In the end, the chapter of the ones who never returned is perhaps the most devastating, and yet it is also the most instructive. It teaches about courage, sacrifice, and the human cost of history. It teaches about the intersection of sport and service, talent and duty. And it reminds us that the NFL, like any institution, is sustained not only by the victories of the living, front offices improvised contracts, signed anyone who could wear a uniform and survive the physical demands of the game, and hoped that teams could remain operational. Survival, rather than championship glory, became the goal. It is impossible to overstate the creative lengths teams went to in order to field a squad. The Philadelphia Eagles, for instance, recruited high school graduates and semi-professional players who were eager to play but inexperienced at the professional level. Teams in smaller markets sometimes advertised open tryouts, welcoming anyone capable of running a route or blocking a lineman. Teams that had relied on scouting networks and draft strategies now had to evaluate men based on limited film or secondhand reports. The NFL became a patchwork, a fragile system held together with improvisation, determination, and the optimism that a game could be played without collapse. Older veterans returned from retirement to fill gaps. Men in their 30s who had left the game for business or personal reasons were persuaded to come back, often in physically diminished condition. Their experience offered guidance and leadership, but they could not replicate the speed, endurance, or explosiveness of younger players. Despite the limitations, their presence was invaluable. They stabilized the roster, provided coaching support on the field, and modeled professionalism in a league struggling to maintain standards. The combination of inexperienced youth and aged veterans produced a league that was unpredictable, unpolished, and yet fiercely resilient. The unpredictability extended to positions and roles. Teams experimented with dual-role players, men who could play both offense and defense out of necessity. Coaches altered formations to accommodate limitations in size, speed, or skill. A quarterback might also line up as a defensive back. A lineman might be asked to carry the ball in certain situations. The improvisation was not elegant, but it was essential. Each week brought a new challenge, with injuries, absences, and enlistments threatening to dismantle rosters entirely. The league held together by adaptability and the sheer determination of players who wanted to keep football alive. Travel and logistics were equally strained. Wartime rationing affected transportation, fuel, and accommodations. Teams often traveled on military trains, sometimes sharing space with service members headed to training or deployment. Hotel rooms were scarce. Meals were limited. Practice facilities were makeshift, often shared with college teams or repurposed gyms. Players had to contend with physical discomfort while simultaneously performing at the highest level they could manage. Despite these hardships, the NFL continued. Schedules were maintained, games were played, and fans remained engaged, drawn not only to sport but to the sense that normal life persisted despite global conflict. The players themselves were a mix of resilience and vulnerability. Young men who had never played beyond high school faced the challenge of competing against veterans or older players who had previously been professional. Older players who returned carried aches, injuries, and slower reflexes. Yet in each case, determination and grit often outweighed experience. Games became unpredictable showcases of human tenacity. A touchdown scored by a teenager on a broken play or a defensive stop by a 40-year-old veteran carried more emotional weight than it might have in a normal season. Each performance was a small triumph of will, a testament to perseverance in the shadow of uncertainty. Front offices worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion of stability. Contracts were drafted, media guides published, and public relations campaigns emphasized continuity and patriotism. Owners recognized that the survival of the league depended on public perception. Fans needed reassurance that football remained a fixture, that teams would show up, and that competition continued, even as players went off to fight in Europe or the Pacific. The league became a microcosm of American perseverance, a reflection of a nation enduring rationing, uncertainty, and sacrifice. Football was no longer merely entertainment. It was a statement of endurance. The role of coaches evolved in this period. They became talent evaluators, psychologists, and mentors, guiding young and inexperienced players while maintaining strategic coherence. Their responsibilities extended beyond teaching plays to fostering morale, instilling confidence, and managing anxiety among men who had been thrust into professional sports under impossible conditions. The success of a season depended less on X's and O's and more on leadership, adaptability, and the ability to inspire performance in a group facing extraordinary challenges. Financial strain added another layer of complexity. Teams with depleted rosters struggled to draw crowds, and revenue was inconsistent. Ticket sales were affected by rationing, travel limitations, and the absence of star players. owners faced the dual challenge of keeping their franchises solvent while sustaining competitive integrity. The league itself had to balance pragmatism with image, ensuring that professional football remained viable while acknowledging that the war had created a fundamentally altered playing field. Survival required innovation, resilience, and a willingness to compromise. Fans who attended games understood the stakes. Every touchdown, interception, and defensive stop was amplified by the knowledge that the players had endured far more than any game normally demanded. Teenagers, veterans, and unfit men lined up together, embodying determination in a way that transcended traditional measures of athletic excellence. Spectators cheered, not merely for the outcome of the game, but for the continuation of a sport that mirrored national perseverance. Attendance might have been modest, but engagement was intense, driven by respect for the challenges faced on and off the field. The season unfolded as a testament to human adaptability. Teams experimented constantly, shuffled rosters, and endured frequent defeats. Yet despite every obstacle, the league held together. Plays that seemed improbable succeeded, and men who should not have been able to compete found ways to rise to the occasion. Mistakes were inevitable, and games were often uneven, but the NFL survived in ways that few had imagined possible in the darkest years of wartime America. The survival of the league became a story of improvisation, courage, and relentless commitment to continuity. Looking back, the NFL at home during World War II represents one of the most remarkable periods of resilience in professional sports history. The league adapted to a talent vacuum, logistical chaos, and societal upheaval with a combination of creativity, determination, and sheer stubbornness. It became a laboratory of improvisation, where young, old, non-conventional players kept the sport alive while the nation confronted the uncertainties of global conflict. Teams persisted, schedules continued, and fans bore witness to the enduring appeal of football, even when the world outside the stadium had changed irreversibly. In reflection, this period of survival mode underscores the human dimension of sport. Football is not only about skill, speed, or strength. It is about adaptability, perseverance, and the ability to confront and overcome challenges that seem insurmountable. The NFL of the war years demonstrated these qualities not in the polished execution of elite talent, but in the determination of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Their efforts ensured that the league would emerge intact, ready to rebuild when the war ended, and provide a foundation for a post-war era of unprecedented growth. While the NFL struggled to field rosters at home, another world of football existed behind barbed wire and military fences. The service football leagues emerged as a byproduct of necessity, a means of sustaining morale, building physical fitness, and preserving a semblance of normalcy for men whose lives had been transformed overnight by war. These leagues were composed of NFL players who had enlisted, collegiate stars who had yet to turn professional, and athletes drawn from every corner of the United States. They were extraordinary games played in extraordinary circumstances, often unseen by the public, yet they embodied a level of skill, strategy, and competition that rivaled or exceeded that of the professional leagues. The military recognized the value of football in training and morale. For men preparing for deployment, football offered a structured environment in which to maintain physical conditioning, reinforce teamwork, and instill discipline. Commanders understood that the same qualities that made a successful athlete agility, endurance, awareness, and resilience were essential on the battlefield. As a result, bases and training camps created teams, organized leagues, and scheduled games with rigor and attention to competition. In many cases, these contests were taken as seriously as any professional or collegiate game, with players treating them as opportunities to prove themselves, maintain readiness, and escape, even temporarily, from the omnipresent reality of war. NFL players who participated in these leagues brought a level of experience and professionalism that elevated the quality of play. Men who had once competed in front of thousands of fans now played in front of their fellow soldiers, often with makeshift equipment, improvised fields, and minimal spectators. The games were a mixture of spectacle and necessity, with participants pushing themselves to display the skills they had honed before enlistment while also building cohesion within military units. Practices were intense, and the stakes were personal, as performance could affect assignments, respect among peers, and personal pride. Among the most storied examples was the team at Camp Lee, Virginia, where professional and collegiate talent came together under the tutelage of a former NFL coach who had joined the Army. Games were played on a simple grass field, often uneven and scarred from previous use, with lines painted crudely on the ground. Despite the conditions, the level of competition was extraordinary. Players executed formations and strategies with precision, blending professional experience with the adaptive creativity necessary to survive on an improvised field. Reports from the time described defensive lines moving with the intensity of professional squads and quarterbacks delivering passes with the accuracy expected in the NFL. The spectacle was extraordinary, though largely confined to the men present. Another notable example took place at Fort Riley, Kansas. The base assembled a team composed of NFL linemen, college backs, and a handful of amateur stars whose physical prowess rivaled that of professional athletes. They played weekly contests against rival bases, military hospitals, and ad hoc teams formed from local recruits. These games became cultural events within the base, drawing soldiers who sought entertainment and a reminder of the world they had left behind. For participants, the games were both a respite and a continuation of competitive drive. Winning and losing mattered in a way that transcended recreation. They were exercises in discipline, morale, and camaraderie. The intensity of service football was amplified by the understanding that the future was uncertain. Players knew that they might be deployed overseas at any moment. Every game carried a weight that professional sports rarely demanded. A blocked punt, a long touchdown, or a perfectly executed play was not merely a point scored. It was a declaration of personal capability, a demonstration of skill under pressure, and a momentary reclaiming of identity in a world defined by uncertainty. These athletes competed not for fame or contracts, but to assert themselves in a context that required both physical and emotional fortitude. Despite being largely invisible to the public, service football leagues contributed to the development of the sport. Innovative strategies emerged, often inspired by the diverse backgrounds of players and the necessity of adaptation to unconventional fields and teams. Playbooks were simplified to accommodate rapid turnover and variable experience levels, but the creativity of athletes shone through. Quarterbacks improvised routes and audibles, linemen adjusted blocking schemes on the fly, and running backs exploited weaknesses in defenses that were less disciplined than professional teams. The military setting forced players to think strategically, react instinctively, and communicate effectively, skills that would later influence the evolution of professional and collegiate football after the war. The social aspect of service football leagues cannot be overstated. These games fostered camaraderie among men who were facing immense stress, danger, and isolation. Playing together reinforced trust, promoted cooperation, and allowed soldiers to experience moments of joy, triumph, and shared accomplishment. Letters from players describe the relief of running a perfect play, the satisfaction of a well-timed tackle, and the camaraderie of celebrating a touchdown with men who had become brothers under extraordinary circumstances. Football became a language through which identity, morale, and resilience were maintained. In addition to skill and strategy, the leagues also served as moral and psychological sustenance. Soldiers reported that the anticipation of games provided a reason to endure grueling drills, long marches, and exhausting training schedules. Football offered structure in an otherwise chaotic environment. The mental preparation required to anticipate plays, react quickly, and support teammates became a mirror of battlefield readiness, reinforcing focus, decision-making, and the ability to perform under pressure. The lessons of the field translated directly into the demands of military life, creating a powerful synergy between sport and service. The ephemeral nature of these leagues adds to their poignancy. Records were often incomplete, rosters changed weekly, and spectators were limited. Yet for the men involved, the significance was profound. NFL stars who might have been playing in sold-out stadiums found themselves anonymous in a crowd of soldiers. Yet the intensity, pride, and passion of play were undiminished. For many, these games represented the last time they would feel unencumbered by the fear and uncertainty of war. The final moments in which football remained pure, a sanctuary from the broader violence that awaited them overseas. The service football leagues also highlighted the resilience of American football as a sport. Even when professional and collegiate leagues were stripped of talent, the game endured. Men adapted to makeshift conditions, imperfect equipment, and irregular schedules. Strategy, skill, and competition persisted, illustrating that football could survive even the most extreme disruptions. The lessons learned in these military leagues' improvisation, leadership, and adaptability would influence post-war football, shaping a generation of players and coaches who had internalized the demands of high-pressure, unpredictable circumstances. In reflecting on the significance of service football, it becomes clear that these leagues were more than diversion or training. They were crucibles of resilience, arenas of extraordinary talent, and testaments to human determination. NFL players who participated in them carried the knowledge that they were maintaining identity, morale, and skill while serving a higher purpose. They embodied the intersection of athleticism and duty, proving that football was not simply a game, but a framework through which men could maintain discipline, cohesion, and pride even in the most challenging circumstances. The legacy of these leagues is subtle but enduring. While largely hidden from the public eye, they preserved a continuity of the sport, maintained the fitness and skill of a generation, and demonstrated the profound link between football and character. They ensured that when the war ended and men returned to the NFL, the league would not simply resume, would emerge with players who had been tested, hardened, and refined under extraordinary pressure. The games behind military fences were invisible to most, but their impact would be felt for decades. In both the evolution of professional football and the enduring ethos of teamwork, resilience, and courage that defines the sport. Returning from the battlefields of World War II, NFL players were not the same men who had left their teams. The physical toll of service was immediate, brutal, and permanent for many. Injuries sustained in combat, whether from shrapnel, gunfire, or accident, altered bodies once finely tuned for athletic performance. The explosive power of a running back, the agility of a wide receiver, and the endurance of a lineman could no longer be taken for granted. Even those who had avoided serious injury carried scars beneath the surface, joints worn down, muscles weakened, reflexes slowed, and bodies shaped by months or years of conditions far harsher than any stadium turf. For some, careers ended the moment they returned. For others, the war created limitations that changed the way they played and the roles they could assume on their teams. The NFL of the late 1940s was, in many ways, a league of resilience. Players returned to crowded locker rooms, facing the challenge of reclaiming their athletic identity. Men who had been stars in their pre-war prime discovered that combat had altered their capacity for performance. Injuries sustained overseas were often treated in field hospitals or makeshift facilities, with limited attention to long-term rehabilitation. Broken bones, torn ligaments, and muscular damage were sometimes hastily repaired to allow a soldier to continue fighting. But those repairs rarely restored the full functional strength of an athlete's body. The result was a generation of players who arrived back at professional football with diminished physical capacity, yet extraordinary determination to compete. One vivid example was that of Bob Kaliser, a lineman who had played for the Detroit Lions before the war. Kaliser served in Europe and was injured during an artillery barrage. His leg was bruised and partially shattered, leaving him with a permanent limp and lingering pain. When he returned to the NFL, he attempted to resume his career as a starting lineman. Coaches quickly recognized that while his experience and football intelligence remained intact, the physical demands of professional play had shifted. Kaliser adapted, playing fewer snaps, focusing on strategy over brute force, and mentoring younger linemen. His story reflects the broader reality that war did not merely remove players from the field, it changed the very way they could perform once they returned. Psychological trauma compounded the physical toll. Many players returned with symptoms we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, a condition that was poorly understood at the time. Nightmares, anxiety, and hypervigilance were common. Some struggled with focus and decision-making, skills essential for success in high-pressure games. Men who had been aggressive and confident on the field sometimes became hesitant or reactive in ways that altered game outcomes. The invisible injuries were no less consequential than visible wounds, yet they were often unacknowledged in a culture that valued toughness and stoicism. The transition to professional play after military service also revealed gaps in conditioning. War imposed a different kind of fitness, emphasizing endurance, load carrying, and repetitive physical labor rather than explosive speed or fine motor skills specific to football. Returning athletes had to retrain their bodies for the precise movements and physical demands of the game. Some succeeded spectacularly, displaying remarkable adaptability and resilience. Others discovered that their bodies, reshaped by months of marching, carrying heavy equipment, and exposure to harsh environments, could no longer withstand the rigors of professional football. The war had exacted a cost that could not be reversed by training or willpower alone. Injuries to hands, shoulders, knees, and ankles were common. Combat-related wounds left lingering pain and reduced mobility, forcing players to adjust their style of play. Running backs with knee injuries learned to run with altered mechanics. Linemen with shoulder damage adapted by relying on leverage and positioning rather than raw strength. Quarterbacks with wrist or hand injuries modified their throwing motion. Each adaptation was a testament to ingenuity and perseverance, yet it also underscored the fragility of athletic careers in the shadow of war. For some, the adaptations were temporary solutions. For others, they became permanent limitations that redefined their role on the team and the trajectory of their professional lives. In addition to acute injuries, exposure to harsh climates, malnutrition, and extreme fatigue during military service had long-term effects on performance. Soldiers endured conditions that taxed cardiovascular, muscular, and skeletal systems beyond the levels encountered on a football field. Returning players often experienced slower recovery times, decreased stamina, and heightened susceptibility to injury. Teams had to adjust training regimens, monitor workloads, and make allowances for veterans whose bodies bore the invisible scars of service. The physical demands of the NFL collided with the realities of post-war rehabilitation, creating a league in which resilience and adaptation became as important as raw talent. The stories of men like Don Curvin illustrate the complex intersection of war and football. Curvin played college football at Boston College and joined the Chicago Cardinals, but his military service left him with back and leg injuries that reduced his speed and power. When he returned to professional play, Curvin relied on experience, positioning, and intelligence rather than athletic explosiveness. His performance remained impressive, yet it carried the imprint of wartime adversity. Curvin's story echoes the experience of countless others, men who returned to a league forever altered, both by the loss of peers and by the changes in their own bodies. For many, the physical toll of war shortened careers. Players who might have competed into their 30s found themselves forced into early retirement due to cumulative injuries or reduced performance. The league lost talent that would have shaped the evolution of the game, leaving a gap in continuity and experience. Yet even those whose careers were curtailed contributed to the post-war NFL in meaningful ways. Coaches, trainers, and mentors benefited from the experience and leadership of veterans who had endured challenges beyond the field. The impact of these men was measured not only in athletic performance, but in the knowledge, discipline, and resilience they imparted to younger players and teams rebuilding after the war. The physical consequences also highlighted the fragility of professional sports in times of global crisis. Teams learned to value versatility, durability, and adaptability in players. The experiences of returning veterans influenced scouting, training, and rehabilitation practices for decades. The league recognized that talent alone was insufficient. The physical and psychological capacity to endure hardship became a central consideration in the evaluation of players. The war had rewritten the parameters of athleticism, and the NFL had no choice but to adapt. Ultimately, the physical toll of war on NFL athletes is a story of both loss and resilience. Men returned with bodies changed by combat, carrying injuries and trauma that altered careers, limited potential, and reshaped the competitive landscape. Yet they also returned with determination, ingenuity, and leadership that enriched the league in ways that statistics alone cannot capture. Their struggle to reclaim their athletic identity serves as a powerful reminder that football, like life, is measured not only by ability, but by perseverance in the face of profound adversity. The war left its mark not only on individual players, but on the league as a whole. Post-war NFL strategies, training methods, and approaches to player health were informed by the lessons learned from a generation of men whose bodies and minds had been tested in ways no regular season ever could. Football was forever changed, shaped by sacrifice and adaptation. And the physical realities of returning veterans remained a defining factor in the evolution of the sport. The stories of injured and altered players remind us that heroism on the battlefield and persistence on the field are intertwined. Players described a visceral reaction to the impact of a block, the sound of a helmet striking another, or the chaos of a broken play. Their minds, trained to anticipate danger in life-or-death situations, struggled to separate past trauma from present action. The psychological toll varied among individuals. Some men adapted and found ways to compartmentalize their experiences, translating the discipline, focus, and situational awareness honed in combat into success on the field. Others struggled, unable to reconcile the battlefield with the game they loved. One former lineman recalled sitting on the bench during a game, his hands trembling, his vision clouded as he remembered the sound of mortar fire from months earlier in Europe. The energy and adrenaline of football could not override the deeply ingrained response to trauma. For these men, returning to professional play was not a celebration of survival, but a confrontation with experiences they could not forget. Teammates and coaches often lacked the language or understanding to provide support. Veterans were expected to return, perform, and endure. Yet many carried mental burdens that compromised focus, consistency, and confidence. The culture of toughness in the NFL compounded the challenge. Weakness was not tolerated, and emotional vulnerability was often interpreted as a lack of character. Men suffered in silence, masking the invisible wounds that influence decision-making, reaction time, and interpersonal relationships within the team. Success depended not only on athletic skill, but also on the ability to navigate psychological obstacles that were largely unacknowledged. In some cases, the inability to reconcile wartime experiences with football led to premature retirement. Players who had been stars before the war found themselves unable to perform at the level required, not because of diminished physical ability, but because their minds were consumed by trauma. The internal struggle was invisible to fans, media, and even teammates, yet it shaped the composition of post-war rosters. Teams had to replace not only bodies, but also players whose psychological scars prevented full participation. The league's adaptation to this challenge was largely informal, relying on experience, mentorship, and observation, rather than structured support systems. Letters, diaries, and interviews from the period offer insight into the internal battles faced by returning veterans. One quarterback wrote about sitting alone in his apartment, unable to sleep, haunted by the sound of explosions. Another player recounted episodes of panic during practice, triggered by the sudden movement of opposing linemen. Teammates often misinterpreted these reactions as laziness, indecision, or lack of commitment, unaware that the players were navigating the invisible consequences of combat exposure. The psychological impact also influenced relationships within teams. Veterans who returned with trauma sometimes withdrew from social interaction, avoided locker room camaraderie, or exhibited irritability and emotional volatility. Over time, however, veteran teammates developed an intuitive understanding, offering support, guidance, and space for recovery. The public, largely unaware of the mental consequences of war, saw only the performance. A player who struggled, hesitated, or missed assignments was criticized, often harshly, without recognition of the battles fought off the field. This disconnect created additional pressure, as men felt compelled to suppress symptoms in order to meet expectations. The absence of formal mental health support meant that self-reliance was essential. Yet even extraordinary resilience could not erase the impact of combat experience. Those who succeeded were remarkable not only for their athleticism, but for their ability to endure invisible burdens while performing at a high level. Some players found that football itself became a coping mechanism. For others, the game became a reminder of what had been lost, the violence of the past intruding into every play. The duality of football, as both therapy and trigger, created a complex psychological landscape that each man had to navigate individually. Psychologists and historians looking back note that these experiences were formative in shaping post-war understanding of trauma in sports. While the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder was decades away from formal recognition, the observations made during this period highlighted the profound influence of combat on performance, focus, and emotional stability. The NFL, consciously or unconsciously, began adapting to the reality that athletic performance was intertwined with mental health, and that resilience involved both body and mind. Veterans who managed to return successfully became examples of extraordinary fortitude, demonstrating that recovery and performance were possible despite profound psychological disruption. For some, the inability to overcome these psychological challenges meant a permanent departure from the game. The NFL lost not only physical talent, but also leadership and experience that would have shaped the post-war era. Teammates mourned the absence of men who had been integral to team dynamics, even as they understood that the invisible consequences of war were beyond their control. The league continued, but every roster, every play, every season carried the imprint of the psychological impact of global conflict. In reflecting on the psychological return of World War II veterans, it is clear that the NFL was shaped as much by mind as by body. The men who returned carried memories, fears, and trauma that influenced every interaction, decision, and play. Success was measured not only in yards gained or touchdowns scored, but in the capacity to endure, adapt, and perform despite internal conflict. The stories of those who could not step onto the field remind us that athletic careers are inseparable from human experience, and that the cost of war is measured not only in lives lost, but in the mental struggles of those who survived. Ultimately, the psychological return emphasizes the complex nature of resilience. It is not simply physical toughness or skill mastery that defines success. It is the ability to navigate trauma, maintain focus, and contribute meaningfully despite internal struggles. The NFL learned in the wake of World War II that performance is inseparable from mental health, and that the legacy of players is defined not only by what they achieved on the field, but by how they endured and adapted in the face of invisible battles. The psychological toll of war shaped the league for decades, influencing coaching, player support, and cultural understanding of trauma in sport. Returning veterans carried lessons in focus, strategy, and human endurance, yet also reminders of the profound cost of global conflict on mind and spirit. Their experience underlines that the history of the NFL is inseparable from the broader history of the nation, and that the sport's evolution cannot be understood without acknowledging the unseen battles fought by those who returned to the field after serving their country. This period marked the NFL's post-war rebirth, a transformation that would solidify football as an integral part of American culture and lay the foundation for its modern prominence. The first challenge was reintegration. Players returning from service had to be physically rehabilitated, psychologically supported, and strategically reintegrated into team systems that had evolved in their absence. Teams relied on the guidance of returning veterans to establish cohesion, leadership, and morale. Their experience on the battlefield and in military leagues translated into a renewed sense of discipline and professionalism on the field. Coaches recognized that the lessons learned in war resilience under pressure, rapid adaptation, teamwork in high-stakes environments were invaluable for rebuilding a competitive league. Public perception played a critical role in the post-war rebirth. Americans, eager to return to normalcy after years of sacrifice and uncertainty, embraced the NFL not merely as a sport, but as a symbol of renewal. The return of veterans resonated deeply with fans, who saw familiar faces back in uniforms carrying the dual weight of athletic talent and military service. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and emerging television coverage highlighted the stories of these men, framing their return as a testament to endurance, courage, and patriotism. The league leveraged this narrative to capture attention, elevate its profile, and create a compelling national identity intertwined with the collective experience of the war. The strategic deployment of returning veterans also influenced the league's competitive landscape. Teams that succeeded in recruiting and reintegrating experienced players quickly gained an advantage. Their presence elevated the quality of play, provided leadership for younger or less experienced teammates, and inspired confidence among fans. This infusion of talent accelerated the professionalization of the league. Coaching strategies evolved to incorporate the tactical insights and adaptability veterans had acquired in military service. Teams began to experiment with formations, play calling, and personnel management in ways that reflected the lessons of both wartime improvisation and high-level football experience. The media amplified this narrative of rebirth. Articles emphasized the heroism of returning players, recounting their military exploits alongside their contributions on the gridiron. Fans were presented with a vision of football as a continuation of the American spirit, a domain in which resilience, discipline, and courage could be celebrated outside the context of war. Stories of touchdowns scored by men who had faced artillery, passes completed by quarterbacks who had survived combat, and linemen who had endured years of grueling physical labor in service of their country captured the imagination of a public eager for both athletic entertainment and heroic narrative. The NFL also benefited from the influx of college stars whose careers had been delayed by the war. A generation of athletes who might have entered the league in the early 1940s now joined in the post-war period, bringing untapped potential and renewed energy. Teams could rebuild rosters with a combination of returning veterans and emerging talent, creating a blend of experience and youthful athleticism. This fusion accelerated the league's competitiveness, enhanced the quality of play, and contributed to a broader national appreciation of football as both a spectacle and a proving ground for personal and collective excellence. The league's post-war rebirth was not only about talent and competition, but also about infrastructure. Attendance at games increased as fans returned to stadiums, eager to witness the sport's revival. Revenues allowed franchises to invest in facilities, coaching staff, and operational improvements. Teams that had survived through wartime adversity now had the resources and stability to plan for sustained growth. The NFL was no longer merely surviving. It was positioned to thrive in a rapidly evolving post-war economy, leveraging the popularity of returning heroes and the growing cultural significance of professional football. Coaching during this period reflected a new understanding of leadership and mentorship. Veterans returning from service brought a perspective shaped by extreme circumstances. And coaches recognized the value of integrating these insights into team dynamics. Emphasis shifted from purely technical instruction to holistic guidance encompassing strategy, teamwork, mental resilience, and discipline. The post-war era demanded leaders who could bridge pre-war and post-war sensibilities, guiding teams composed of veterans, young players, and previously inexperienced recruits. The result was a league in which leadership, adaptability, and character became defining qualities alongside athletic talent. The social and cultural context of the post-war rebirth cannot be overstated. Football became a vehicle for community identity, a shared experience linking veterans, families, and civilians who had endured the hardships of war. Stadiums became sites of collective memory, places where the stories of survival, heroism, and perseverance were honored through the celebration of athletic achievement. The NFL's national profile expanded not only because of the game itself, but because the league embodied broader societal values emerging from the post-war moment: resilience, courage, teamwork, and the capacity to overcome adversity. At the individual level, the post-war era allowed players to reclaim or redefine their identities. For those who had returned with injuries or psychological scars, football offered a structured environment in which to navigate recovery and reintegration. Success on the field could restore confidence, provide purpose, and offer a sense of continuity after years of dislocation and upheaval. Veterans who had endured the uncertainty of combat found in the gridiron a domain where discipline, preparation, and skill could be exercised safely with tangible outcomes. Football became a mirror through which men could measure their resilience, reclaim agency, and contribute to a national narrative of renewal. The league's rebirth also marked the beginning of a more nationalized and commercially aware approach. Returning veterans were leveraged not only as players, but as public symbols, linking the sport to broader narratives of American identity, patriotism, and post-war optimism. Attendance, media coverage, and public interest surged. the NFL began to emerge as a central feature of American culture. Its growth fueled by the story's performance and perseverance of men who had survived the war and returned to compete at the highest level. The rebirth was not without challenges. Teams had to manage the diverse needs of returning veterans, including physical limitations, psychological trauma, and readjustment to civilian life. Not every player returned at full capacity, and rosters required careful management to balance experience, potential, and adaptability. Yet the NFL's ability to navigate these challenges reflected the resilience cultivated during the war years. Improvisation, leadership, and a commitment to continuity allowed the league not only to survive the post-war transition, but to capitalize on the extraordinary circumstances of a nation emerging from global conflict. By the late 1940s, the NFL had transformed from a fragile regional league into a competitive, nationally recognized institution. The stories of returning veterans were central to this transformation. Their presence on the field validated the league's identity as a symbol of endurance, courage, and American spirit. Football became a conduit through which the experiences of war were translated into sport, culture, and public consciousness. The league's growth in talent, popularity, stability was inseparable from the contributions of these men, whose service had shaped both their personal trajectories and the identity of professional football. In reflection, the post-war rebirth of the NFL represents a profound intersection of sport, society, and history. The league capitalized on the return of heroes, not merely to fill rosters, but to craft a narrative of national resilience and renewal. The transformation of the NFL during this period laid the foundation for the modern game, embedding lessons of perseverance, adaptability, and leadership within the culture of the league. The post-war era demonstrated that football, as a sport and as a national institution, could emerge stronger from crisis, enriched by the extraordinary experiences of the men who returned to define it anew. The war did not only take players from the field, it took minds as well. Coaches, strategists, and tactical innovators were drafted or volunteered for service, leaving behind empty offices, unfinished diagrams, and playbooks that would remain dormant for years. Football's intellectual engine was paused, and the natural evolution of strategy was delayed in ways that shaped the league for decades. Teams that relied on the brilliance of minds who had spent years in uniform were forced to improvise, recycle old schemes, or adopt simpler, less nuanced approaches. The lost playbooks represent not just a historical footnote, but a profound reshaping of the game's development. Before the war, football was already evolving rapidly. Coaches experimented with formations, passing concepts, blocking schemes, and special team strategies that pushed the limits of what players could execute. Innovation was driven by a combination of player skill, coaching, vision, and the study of opponents. Film rooms were small laboratories where ideas were tested, refined, and implemented. Every season promised new tactical developments. But with the draft and enlistment sweeping through the league and college ranks, this process was interrupted. The absence of key minds created a strategic void, one that had consequences far beyond the immediate seasons of war. One striking example is the impact on passing strategy. In the late 1930s, quarterbacks and coaches were experimenting with complex dropbacks, deceptive motions, and timing patterns that would later define the modern passing game. Many of the innovators were now overseas. Without their insight, teams relied on more rudimentary schemes, emphasizing power running and simple passing concepts. The result was a temporary stagnation in offensive complexity, a pause in the evolution of football intelligence at the professional level. When these minds returned, they found a league that had survived but remained tactically simpler than it might have been, forcing a period of reinvention to catch up to the ideas that had been postponed. The interruption extended to defensive strategy as well. Defensive coordinators, many of whom were also players or former college stars, had envisioned intricate schemes for coverage, blitzing, and alignment. With their absence, teams relied on brute strength, individual effort, and reactive tactics rather than coordinated, proactive defenses. The art of disguise, anticipation, and layered strategy had to be relearned when these innovators returned from service. In many ways, the NFL's defensive sophistication was delayed by a generation, and the foundational knowledge had to be reconstructed under the pressure of a competitive post-war league. Military service had the paradoxical effect of broadening perspective, while simultaneously disconnecting minds from football. Men who had been tactical innovators found themselves engaged in planning, logistics, and leadership far beyond the scope of sport. Strategy in the military was real, consequential, and immediate. For some, this experience enriched their understanding of discipline, risk assessment, and leadership, knowledge that would later translate into coaching. For others, the years away meant a break from meticulous study, leaving playbooks collecting dust and delaying the implementation of innovative ideas that could have reshaped the league earlier. Film study, a cornerstone of tactical evolution, suffered profoundly. Without coaches and key players to review games, identify tendencies, and develop countermeasures, the refinement of strategy slowed. Teams had to rely on memory, improvisation, and observational learning from limited games during the war. Many of the insights that would have been developed in uninterrupted seasons were postponed or lost entirely. Returning veterans were tasked with bridging gaps, not only in personnel, but in institutional knowledge. Reconstructing plays, formations, and schemes that had been envisioned but never executed during wartime. The lost playbooks also had a cultural impact on the league. Innovation had been concentrated in certain franchises, often those with visionary coaches or programs known for tactical daring. When these figures were absent, their teams struggled, and the competitive balance shifted. Franchises that could maintain continuity or attract returning minds early gained a tactical advantage, while others fell behind. The war created a period in which innovation was unevenly distributed, leaving fingerprints on standings, rivalries, and the broader evolution of the NFL. Stories from the period illustrate the human cost of lost playbooks. Coaches returning from service described piles of notes, partially completed diagrams, and strategies in which the context had changed entirely. Players had aged, bodies had changed, and the competitive landscape had evolved. Reintroducing complex plays required not only teaching concepts to teammates, who may have missed key developmental years, but also recalibrating strategies for a league that had improvised through the absence of leadership. It was a process of reconstruction, combining memory, insight, and adaptation to restore the intellectual rigor that had been interrupted by war. The lost playbooks were not only a tactical issue, but a psychological one. Players and coaches returning from service faced pressure to reclaim past ideas, while demonstrating relevance and leadership in a league that had survived without them. Expectations were high, and failure to adapt quickly risked both team performance and individual credibility. Veterans had to balance respect for the ingenuity they had left behind with the practical realities of rosters that had evolved in their absence. Many succeeded, but the process was neither easy nor immediate. The war had altered not only physical bodies and careers, but the very intellectual fabric of the sport. The reconstruction of strategy became a defining feature of the post-war NFL. Returning innovators integrated lessons from military service with pre-war tactical knowledge, creating hybrid approaches that reflected both football and battlefield experience. Complex schemes that had been paused for years were refined, implemented, and eventually became part of the foundation of modern play. The interruption caused by the lost playbooks ultimately produced a generation of coaches and players who were both resilient and adaptive, capable of creative problem-solving under pressure. In this sense, the disruption became an unanticipated catalyst for evolution, producing a league that was stronger, more versatile, and informed by a broader spectrum of human experience. The lost playbooks also highlight the interconnectedness of time, circumstance, and innovation. Football, like all intellectual endeavors, requires continuity, observation, and refinement. When these processes are disrupted, progress is delayed. The wartime absence of key minds demonstrated how fragile the intellectual progress of the sport can be, and how dependent innovation is on both the individuals who conceive ideas and the systems that sustain them. The post-war period became a testament to human ingenuity in restoring continuity, bridging gaps, and translating experience into renewed strategic development. In reflection, the story of the lost playbooks underscores the dual nature of war's impact on football. It robbed the League of Minds for years, slowing innovation and leaving gaps in tactical evolution. Yet it also created circumstances in which returning players and coaches could integrate extraordinary experiences into the game, enriching strategy with lessons learned in the crucible of service. The interruption was painful, disorienting, and consequential. But it also laid the groundwork for a post-war NFL that would combine intellect, experience, and resilience in ways that reshaped the sport permanently. The lost playbooks serve as a reminder that the evolution of football is inseparable from the broader currents of history. Strategy, innovation, and tactical brilliance were delayed because of global conflict. But the post-war reconstruction created a league that was ultimately stronger, wiser, and more adaptive. Players and coaches returning from service were tasked with rebuilding not only teams, but the intellectual architecture of the game itself. A challenge that required insight, patience, and determination. Their success would define the competitive and strategic character of the NFL for decades to come. The return of veterans to the NFL after World War II did not simply restore players to the field. It also reshaped the culture of coaching in profound ways. Men who had faced combat, led troops, and endured hardship brought a level of discipline, emotional depth, and strategic insight that transformed teams from within. Their experience under fire became a blueprint for leadership, one that emphasized accountability, resilience, and the human dimension of sport. Veterans turned coaches fundamentally altered the way football was taught, played, and understood, creating a culture that valued both toughness and intelligence. Many returning players who transitioned into coaching drew directly from their military experience. They had learned to lead men under extreme pressure, make decisions with incomplete information, and maintain cohesion in the face of chaos. On the football field, these skills translated seamlessly into leadership. A veteran coach understood the importance of preparation, of clear communication, and of instilling confidence in players who might otherwise doubt their abilities. The war had trained them to assess strengths and weaknesses quickly, to make rapid adjustments, and to inspire trust and loyalty among diverse groups of men. They emphasized punctuality, accountability, and professionalism, traits that extended beyond athletic skill. Players were expected to respect both the game and their teammates, reflecting a sense of collective responsibility learned in military service. The lessons they imparted extended far beyond individual games, influencing the development of the league and the careers of countless players. Veterans also brought a long-term vision to coaching. Their experience in the military underscored the importance of planning, preparation, and the cultivation of systems that could function under pressure. Post-war teams benefited from structured programs that integrated physical conditioning, strategic development, and leadership training. It was also defined by character, strategy, and the ability to endure challenges, lessons imparted by men whose experiences extended far beyond the stadium. Ultimately, the veterans who became coaches left a legacy that transcended individual seasons or teams. They transformed the ethos of the NFL, integrating lessons learned in war into the culture of professional sport. Their influence is evident in the emphasis on preparation, adaptability, leadership, and resilience that continues to define the league. They demonstrated that football was not merely a game, but a reflection of human endurance, intelligence, and the capacity to overcome adversity. Their contributions ensured that the post-war NFL was stronger, more sophisticated, and more human than it had been before the conflict. The stories of these coaches underscore the profound connection between life experience and leadership in sport. Men who had faced death, uncertainty, and chaos in combat returned to the field and applied those lessons to football, shaping a generation of players and the trajectory of the league. Their discipline became institutionalized. Their toughness became cultural expectation. And their emotional depth became a guiding principle for teams seeking both performance and cohesion. The post-war NFL would not have been the same without them. In reflection, the influence of veteran coaches illustrates how adversity can be transformed into opportunity. The league gained not only players, but mentors, strategists, and leaders whose vision extended beyond immediate victories. They molded teams, influenced culture, and enriched the strategic and emotional fabric of professional football. Their legacy is a reminder that leadership is forged in trial, that resilience is cultivated through experience, and that the enduring power of football lies in the human capacity to adapt, endure, and inspire. There's a moment after any war when silence becomes louder than the battlefield ever was. It is the moment when a man realizes he has survived something that should have taken him. When he confronts the reality that the life he once knew no longer exists in the form he left behind. For many NFL players returning from World War II, that moment arrived before they even touched a football again. They stepped off trains and ships into hometowns that felt strangely unfamiliar, surrounded by faces that celebrated their return but could not understand the look in their eyes. They had been athletes once, competitors defined by skill, strength, and confidence. The war had broken that definition and scattered it across continents. Now they faced the task of rebuilding who they were, piece by piece, with memories that often refused to cooperate. For some, football became the foundation of that reconstruction. The field offered structure, familiarity, and a sense of control that had been absent for years. The rituals of practice, the camaraderie of teammates, and the clarity of competition provided something the war had taken: purpose. A man who had been forced to fight for survival discovered once again the meaning of fighting for something he loved. They had to decide which parts of themselves could be recovered and which had to be left behind. Football offered a mirror, reflecting both what could be regained and what could never return. A player might recognize the instinctive movements of his body, the muscle memory of routes and stances, yet feel disconnected from the fire that once drove him. Others rediscovered hunger, ambition, and passion in ways that surprised even them. The process was deeply personal and rarely linear, carrying each man along a path shaped by his own experiences in war. Some return players struggled with guilt as they attempted to reclaim a life interrupted. For those who had lost friends in combat, the simple act of chasing a ball could feel trivial or indulgent. They questioned why they survived when others did not, why they were granted the chance to run across a field while someone else's life ended on foreign soil. That guilt seeped into their identity, shaping how they approached the game and how they viewed themselves. Every touchdown felt lighter than the weight they carried. Every victory echoed with the memory of names they could never forget. Others found healing through the very nature of competition. The structured violence of football, unlike the chaotic violence of war, offered a kind of catharsis. Hits were controlled. Outcomes were known. There were rules, boundaries, and a sense of fairness that combat lacked. Veterans who had been conditioned to operate under constant tension found relief in a sport that allowed them to channel their intensity without fear of the unforeseen. They learned to direct adrenaline toward plays, not survival. For some, that transformation helped dim the harshest memories, giving them a place to expend emotions that had nowhere else to go. Teammates also played a role in this reconstruction of identity. Locker rooms became places where veterans could exist without explanation. A nod, a quiet moment, a shared joke meant more than any well-meaning sympathy from civilians. Players understood hardship in their own way, and although most had not been to war, they recognized struggle when they saw it. They treated returning veterans not as fragile men, but as teammates deserving of respect. This unspoken understanding helped many veterans feel grounded again, providing a sense of belonging when the rest of the world felt foreign. But there were veterans who could never escape their wartime selves, who found that football only widened the gap between who they had been and who they had become. They stepped onto the field and felt nothing. Plays unfolded without emotion. Crowds cheered without meaning. The game that once defined them now felt like a stranger. For these men, identity reconstruction became a quieter, more difficult process. They had to accept that some chapters of their life were closed permanently. Football, once a lifeline, became a reminder that recovery does not always lead back to where one began. The league itself played a part in how these men pieced themselves together. Teams often celebrated returning veterans publicly, using their stories to inspire fans and build pride. Players were honored at halftime ceremonies, featured in newspapers, and held up as symbols of resilience. While this recognition brought gratitude, it also created expectations. Veterans were expected to embody strength even when they felt weak, to represent hope even when they were struggling. The pressure to live up to an idealized version of themselves added another layer to their identity work, making the process more complex and often more painful. Family life also shaped how veterans reconstructed who they were. Wives, parents, and children welcomed them with love, but that love sometimes carried assumptions about a return to normalcy. Veterans found themselves caught between gratitude for their families and the private reality that they were not the same men who had left. Simple interactions felt heavy. Conversations felt strained. The pace of ordinary life felt too fast or too slow. Many players discovered that the identities they held before the war no longer fit, and they had to learn how to redefine themselves within their families just as they did on the field. Some veterans eventually transitioned into roles that allowed them to share their experiences indirectly. Coaching, mentoring, or community involvement became ways to channel what they carried. They taught younger players about discipline, resilience, and the importance of unity. They found meaning in guiding others, even when they struggled to guide themselves. Through these roles, they carved out identities that blended their wartime lessons with their love for the game, creating a bridge between past and present that felt authentic and sustainable. Others sought solitude, moving away from the spotlight or retiring quietly. For them, reconstruction required distance from both the battlefield and the stadium. They found identity not in public roles, but in personal pursuits, redefining themselves through family, work, or introspection. In the end, identity reconstruction for NFL veterans was a journey without a universal path. The war had reshaped them in ways that neither football nor society could fully comprehend. Some rebuilt themselves through the game, finding strength in its structure and community. Others discovered that their identity had shifted too far for football to bring them back. And many existed somewhere in between, navigating the tension between the men they had been and the men they were becoming. What united them was the resilience required to confront that journey, the courage to examine what the war had taken and what remained, and the determination to create meaning from experiences that defied understanding. Their stories reveal that survival is more than simply staying alive. It is the daily work of rebuilding one's sense of self, of learning to live with memory, and of finding new ways to move forward. Football helped some heal, but healing never took one form. It took thousands of quiet decisions, thousands of moments when a man chose to keep going, to keep searching for the pieces of himself that mattered most. Their reconstruction became part of the league's history, shaping not only their lives, but the emotional depth of football itself. In their journey from war back to the field, and in the years that followed, they showed that identity is not destroyed by trauma, but reshaped by the will to endure. Their lives remind us that the human spirit is capable of rebuilding even after its deepest fractures. And that strength often emerges in the fragile space between who we were and who we must become. When I look back at the story of football during the Second World War, there is a moment that always returns to me. It is not a game or a statistic or a heroic battlefield account. It is the image of a mother sitting alone at her kitchen table with a letter in her hand. The letter is creased from being opened too many times. The ink has faded in places where tears settled before they dried. The handwriting belongs to a son who once dreamed of playing on Sunday afternoons but never made it home. That single image contains the quieter truth of wartime football, the one that existed far from stadiums and marching cadences. It lived inside homes where families carried the weight of uncertainty, sacrifice, and permanent loss. Their voices shaped the emotional landscape of the sport just as much as the men who fought overseas. The families of football players who served in the war lived in a space between pride and fear. They followed service updates with the same intensity they once reserved for game recaps. They learned the geography of unfamiliar islands and European towns because their fathers, husbands, or sons were stationed there. They read headlines while imagining the faces of men they loved in those distant stories. Many of these families had watched their players rise through high school ranks, excel in college, and step into professional locker rooms with dreams of long careers. When the war took them away, the trajectory of those dreams fractured into something heavier, something shaped more by survival than by sport. Letters became the lifeline that kept families connected to players serving abroad. These letters carried fragments of hope and fear mixed with a quiet determination to stay emotionally intact. Some were brief notes written during moments of calm, promising that everything was all right, even when it was not. Others were long reflections about the nature of war, the way the mind changes under stress, and the memories of home that kept a man grounded in a world of chaos. Families read these words again and again, searching for any sign of reassurance. Wives kept them in bedside drawers. Children tucked them under pillows. Parents stored them alongside old photographs, creating small personal archives that preserved the last traces of who their loved ones had been before the war hardened them. Many players wrote about memories of the field. They described the feeling of lacing up cleats, the sound of a crowd, or the way their bodies felt during a late autumn practice. These recollections were not about games as much as they were about identity. The sport had shaped their sense of purpose, and writing about it helped them hold on to the parts of themselves that war threatened to erase. Families cherished these connections. They felt honored that in the middle of conflict, their players still remembered the rhythm of home. But with the letters came silence. Weeks and sometimes months passed without any word. Families lived in that silence with a kind of suspended breath that never fully released. They checked mailboxes with ritualistic urgency. They listened for the footsteps of delivery men who carried government telegrams. They prayed the silence meant nothing more than the movement of troops. Over time, that silence became its own emotional state, a place where hope and dread coexisted without resolution. When news finally arrived, it often shaped the emotional future of an entire household. Some families received joyous updates. Their players had survived a battle or recovered from an injury. Others received messages that altered their lives forever. The words were usually formal, written in official military language that felt too cold for the significance of the loss. These letters acknowledged sacrifice, but they could not articulate what the death of a son or husband meant to a family that had built dreams around him. They could not capture the sound of a child asking when their father would return, or the heavy quiet that settled in a home that once echoed with laughter. For those who lost players, football became a memory suspended in time. The sport represented the last moments before everything changed. Wives faced an especially complex grief. Many had married young, believing their lives would unfold through seasons marked by games, careers, and the building of a family. For those who were too young to remember their fathers, these stories became the foundation of their identity. They carried pride alongside sadness, aware that the world saw their fathers as heroes, but wishing they had known them as ordinary parents who could toss a ball in the yard or sit with them during a quiet evening at home. Some children found solace in the game. They picked up football as a way to feel connected. Others avoided it, unable to face the reminder of what had been lost. Parents faced a different kind of mourning. They remembered the earliest days when their sons first picked up a football, when they saw promise in their athleticism and spirit. They had supported dreams of professional careers, traveling to games and celebrating victories. When the war took their sons, they carried grief that felt larger than words. They thought about the boy who had grown into a man and then into a soldier. They held onto jerseys, scrapbooks, and newspaper clippings as testaments to lives that had been full of potential. Their homes became museums of memory. Every photograph, every clipping, and every letter held emotional weight that they revisited year after year. There were families who welcomed players home but discovered they were not the same men who had left. These families faced their own emotional battle. The war had altered personalities, disrupted sleep, and changed the way returning veterans communicated affection or expressed anger. Some families grew even closer, working through the pain with patience and love. Others struggled in silence, unsure how to help a man whose mind carried scars no one could see. Football sometimes offered relief, giving returning veterans a sense of normalcy and purpose. But for others, the sport reminded them too much of who they had been before the war, a version of themselves they no longer recognized. The emotional stories of these families reveal a truth that statistics cannot measure. The war did not simply interrupt the careers of players. It fractured the emotional foundations of the households that loved them. It shaped marriages, altered childhoods, and changed the course of parents' lives. These families lived with sacrifices that were not recorded in box scores or headline stories. They carried the weight of both pride and loss. Feeling honored to be connected to men who served their country, but burdened by the emotional cost of that service. When I reflect on this chapter of football history, I find that these families embody the deepest form of resilience. They witnessed a transformation of the sport that the wider public could not see. They held on to hope in the face of uncertainty, endured silence with patience, and rebuilt lives after devastating loss. Their stories reveal that the legacy of wartime football stretches far beyond the field. It lives in the letters they preserved, the memories they guarded, and the strength they showed when the world around them changed irreversibly. Their legacy is a reminder that football is made up of more than players and statistics. It is shaped by the people who wait at home, who believe in the men who take the field, and who endure the consequences when those men are called to serve. The sacrifices of these families are etched into the history of the sport. They form a silent chorus behind every game played in the years that followed. Their love, loss, and loyalty ensured that the story of wartime football remains human at its core. Their voices echo through the generations, speaking to the cost of war and the power of family resilience. There are moments in American history when a sport becomes something larger than the contest played on the field. When the Second World War ended, football found itself in a place it had never been before. It emerged not as a pastime, not as a simple competition among teams, but as a symbol of the country's resilience and identity. The war had changed the nation, and in the process, it changed the meaning of football. What had once been a young and growing game became a cultural force that represented unity, sacrifice, and determination. The transformation was not sudden. It unfolded through the stories of players who served, the families who waited, and the national soul-searching that followed victory and loss. When people looked at football in the late 1940s, they saw more than plays and scores. They saw a reflection of who they believed they were as Americans. Before the war, football had been popular, but it had not yet become a defining cultural thread. Baseball dominated the national imagination, and college football commanded more attention than the professional league. The NFL was still finding its footing, still building teams, fans, and credibility. They fought beside men from small towns, big cities, and every kind of background. Every time they stepped onto the field, the public saw not only athletes, but veterans who embodied the nation's endurance. Their presence on rosters, sidelines, and coaching staffs made football feel like an extension of the national story. The narrators of the American wartime experience often highlighted unity as the defining virtue of the generation. Football reinforced that message. The sport required coordination, trust, and collective responsibility. It demanded that individuals sacrifice personal glory for the success of the team. Fans watching the post-war league saw reflections of the wartime ethic they had lived through. They recognized the parallels between battlefield cooperation and the precision of an offensive line. They saw the qualities they admired in returning veterans expressed through the rhythms of the game. Football became a living metaphor for the nation's belief that unity was powerful and necessary. The mythology of football also expanded during this time. Stories about players who had fought in battles captured the public imagination. Newspapers retold accounts of courage, survival, and loss. Fans viewed these men with a sense of reverence. Their return to the field symbolized resilience and hope. Even those who had been physically altered by war carried symbolic significance. Their presence testified to the human capacity to endure hardship and continue striving. The narrative of the game evolved from simple athletic achievement to something deeper. It became a stage for resilience, perseverance, and the rebuilding of identity. As the nation entered the late 1940s, football games became gatherings where communities reconnected. People brought their wartime experiences with them to the stadium. They carried memories of service, rationing, sacrifice, and separation. The game offered a space where they could celebrate life and return to familiar rituals. Every cheer, every halftime conversation, every shared moment of suspense felt like a reaffirmation that the nation had survived and was rebuilding. Football's cultural significance grew because it helped people process the transition from war to peace. The growth of radio broadcasts and the expansion of newspaper coverage played an important role. Reporters framed football as a reflection of American values. They described players as examples of determination and courage. They emphasized strategy as a form of intelligence and leadership. They connected individual games to broader national themes. When families read these accounts or listened to broadcasts, they were reminded that football represented more than entertainment. It stood for the qualities they believed were essential to the American character. College football also changed during this period. Many college teams had lost players to the war. When they returned, they brought maturity, discipline, and perspective that affected team dynamics. The presence of veterans on college rosters elevated the level of play and intensified competition. Crowds became larger. Rivalries became more symbolic. College football became a cultural anchor for a generation seeking stability after years of upheaval. The sport became intertwined with the coming-of-age experience of men who had already lived through trials that shaped their understanding of life. The NFL capitalized on this cultural moment. The league highlighted its returning veterans. It emphasized their sacrifices in promotional materials, interviews, and public appearances. Teams understood that fans admired players who had served with honor. Owners and executives recognized that these stories reinforced the identity of football as a symbol of national strength. As the league grew, it positioned itself as part of the American experience. Games became rituals that marked the passing of seasons and the steady return to normal life. This strategy shaped the long-term mythology of football, cementing its role in the national consciousness. Football's transformation was also influenced by the era's shifting cultural expectations. The country valued physical strength but also valorized emotional resilience. Veterans embodied both. Fans admired players who had lived through trauma and still performed with determination. This admiration created an emotional connection between the public and the game. People felt that football honored the sacrifices of those who had served. They believed the sport represented the ideals that had carried the nation through war. As football became more culturally significant, it also became a space where the country processed its collective identity. The game evolved into a form of storytelling. Each season offered narratives that mirrored national experiences. Teams that struggled and then triumphed symbolized resilience. Underdogs represented the hope that anyone could rise through perseverance. Hard-fought victories echoed the belief that success came through unity and effort. Football became a kind of national theater that translated the lessons of war into stories that people could witness and share. This cultural shift extended into the way players were perceived. They were not just athletes, they were seen as role models, community figures, and symbols of strength. Veterans who returned to football carried an elevated status. Their presence gave younger players a standard to aspire to. Fans viewed them as embodiments of courage and integrity. Their stories became part of the mythology that defined football for generations. Even those who did not return to the league remained part of the narrative. Their sacrifices were remembered in tributes, articles, and recollections that reinforced football's connection to national values. The transformation of football after the war was not orchestrated by any single person or institution. It emerged organically from the collective experiences of a nation seeking meaning after years of global conflict. Football became a vessel for that meaning because it combined physical intensity with emotional resonance. It offered a stage where the values of teamwork, courage, and perseverance could be replayed each weekend. It allowed people to celebrate resilience and honor sacrifice in a peaceful arena. The sport grew because it reflected the emotional truth of the era. When I consider the cultural shift that took place, I see a moment when football stopped being a developing sport and became a national identity. The war shaped this transformation by connecting the game to the lived experiences of millions. The players who served carried their stories onto the field. Families brought their emotions to the stands. Fans brought their hopes to every kickoff. Together, they forged a new meaning for football. It became a symbol of strength, unity, and the enduring spirit of a country that had survived its greatest test. There comes a moment in any historical journey when you are forced to confront the silent spaces. The parts of the story that were never written because the people who should have shaped them never had the chance. When I think about football during the Second World War, those unwritten pages are the ones that weigh the heaviest. They belong to the generation that might have changed everything. The players whose talent was already rising. The teams that were beginning to form dynasties, and the records that were poised to be shattered. The war interrupted all of it. It redirected lives, halted careers, and erased possibilities that will never be fully known. This chapter is not about what happened. It is about what might have happened if the world had remained at peace and football had not lost some of its brightest young stars. Before the war began, football stood on the threshold of evolution. College stadiums were filled every weekend with players who possessed natural athleticism, strategic intelligence, and competitive hunger that promised to reshape the professional game. These young men had already shown glimpses of greatness. Scouts knew their names. Coaches spoke of them with confidence. Fans anticipated their future. Yet once the war intensified, these same players found themselves trading cleats for boots and playbooks for field manuals. Their gifts were rerouted toward the needs of a nation. Many never returned. Others returned changed in ways that ended their athletic potential. The football world was forced to imagine what they might have accomplished, but never did. When I reflect on these lost possibilities, I think first about the quarterbacks. There were young leaders emerging from college programs who possessed rare vision and accuracy. They had the calm confidence that could command a field. Their decision-making hinted at a new style of offense that might have evolved earlier if they had reached the professional level. They were on the verge of transforming the passing game into a more dynamic system. Instead, those young quarterbacks headed overseas, where their leadership was expressed through entirely different responsibilities. Some returned with injuries that made throwing impossible. Some returned with minds burdened by memories that prevented them from ever finding the calm required to stand tall in a pocket. Others never came back at all. Running backs were another part of this alternate history. Before the war, several college backs displayed the kind of power and speed combination that suggested they would become legendary. They ran with instinctive intelligence. They knew how to find holes before they formed. They carried themselves with a confidence that made defenders wary. These young backs were poised to bring a new level of athleticism to the league. Yet, instead of carving out careers defined by yardage and postseason glory, they became soldiers. Their bodies, meant for the controlled violence of a football field, were exposed to the uncontrolled violence of war. Some returned with injuries that robbed them of mobility. Some returned with spirits wounded by the things they had seen. Some did not return at all. The game lost a generation of potential legends whose names never appeared in record books. Linemen also carried enormous untapped potential. These were athletes who understood leverage, footwork, and the art of controlling space. They were beginning to master techniques that would later define modern offensive and defensive lines. Their strength and discipline could have shaped new strategies. Their presence might have altered the balance of power in entire divisions. but wartime duty pulled them away. Many served in roles that demanded physical strain beyond anything football required. When they came home, their hands bore the scars of heavy labor. Their bodies were reshaped by years of military work. Their football futures had slipped away while they were building roads, loading equipment, or fighting through the most dangerous moments of combat. Entire teams were also shaped by the absence of this lost generation. The war interrupted roster development, halted chemistry among players, and prevented coaches from building long-term strategies. Some franchises were on the verge of greatness. They had young talent rising at every position. Their systems were becoming finely tuned. Their coaches had fresh ideas waiting to be tested. Had the war not intervened, these teams might have formed dynasties that redefined the competitive landscape. Instead, their trajectories collapsed under the pressure of depleted rosters and constant uncertainty. Their history is now remembered not for what they built, but for what they lost. There is also the question of records. Several young athletes appeared ready to break long-standing marks in rushing, passing, or scoring. Their early statistics suggested a potential that could have rewritten entire sections of league history. But the war erased the prime years of their athletic lives. Some returned too late to regain their previous form. Others carried injuries that forced early retirement. Their names remain in scattered archives, mentioned occasionally in articles about what might have been. Their numbers never grew beyond those early seasons. Their careers became fragments with no chance for completion. The coaches lost to war also shaped this alternate history. Many of them had been assistants or young strategists on the rise. They possessed analytical minds that could have altered the evolution of football. Their approaches to offense and defense were ahead of their time. They might have invented new formations or refined existing ones. They might have trained players to think differently about strategy, yet the war pulled them out of the sport during critical years. Some returned with different priorities. Others returned with injuries that prevented them from coaching. Some never returned. Their absence created a gap in the intellectual development of football. The sport advanced in later decades, but part of its potential innovation was delayed because the minds that might have shaped it were lost to war. One of the most striking elements of this generation that could have been lies in the stories of players who served but lived. These men returned home, carrying a quiet understanding that their prime was over. They stepped onto a field again and felt the difference immediately. They knew their speed had changed. Their reflexes had slowed. Their confidence had been affected by the weight of their memories. Some tried to compete again. Others knew the game had moved beyond what they could physically or emotionally offer. They carried an awareness that their best years had been spent far from the sport they loved. Their reflections became part of the emotional fabric of wartime football. They spoke of dreams altered by necessity, careers redirected by duty, and futures reimagined in ways no young athlete anticipates. I often think about the fans who never witnessed the greatness that might have emerged. They supported teams through wartime rosters filled with older players, teenagers, and men classified as unfit for service. They cheered, but they also wondered. They imagined what the game might have looked like with full rosters, complete coaching staffs, and uninterrupted seasons. They imagined what rivalries would have formed, what stars would have risen, and what championships might have shifted hands. Their longing became part of the mythology of wartime football, a collective recognition that the sport had been reshaped by forces far beyond the field. In the end, the story of the generation that could have been is a quiet but powerful chapter of football history. It represents the cost of war in terms that statistics cannot fully capture. It reveals the potential that was sacrificed and the dreams that were reshaped. It reminds us that football is not only defined by the players who became legends, but also by those who never received the opportunity. Their absence shaped the game in subtle but profound ways. They left behind a space that cannot be measured in yards or victories, but that remains an essential part of the sport's identity. The legacy of this lost generation lives in the understanding that greatness is sometimes built on the shoulders of stories that were never told. The sport evolved after the war, but it did so with the knowledge that its history was incomplete. The generation that could have been stands as a reminder that war changes not only nations, but the trajectory of every life it touches. Their unfinished story is woven into every record, every dynasty, and every moment of triumph that followed. The story of football in World War II always returns to the same quiet truth. The game that would one day define American Sundays was nearly erased before it ever had the chance to become a national ritual. The players who filled its early rosters marched not toward stadium tunnels, but toward the beaches of Normandy, the islands of the Pacific, and the freezing forests of the Ardennes. The numbers alone tell only the surface of the story. Every modern innovation, every iconic moment, every celebrated superstar has an invisible connection to the men who left the field and never returned. Their absence shaped the game as powerfully as their presence once did. Before the war, football was still figuring itself out. After the war, it emerged, hardened, elevated, and profoundly changed. That transformation came at a price. It came from men who understood that the championships waiting back home would mean nothing if their country did not survive. They were not thinking about touchdowns. They were thinking about the boys next to them in the trenches. They were thinking about the letters tucked in their pockets. They were thinking about the hope that someday they might hear a marching band again or step onto grass that was not torn apart by shells. They played a different kind of game. One where the stakes were measured not by scoreboards, but by life itself. I often imagine the faces of those who returned. They walked into stadiums that had kept operating without them, filled with teammates who somehow made it through the war untouched. Behind every smile during those early post-war seasons, there was a shadow. Some players had earned medals for valor. Some had lost friends on battlefields they could barely bring themselves to describe. Some had come back with injuries that changed the way they moved. They wore pads that pressed against scars. They stepped into huddles carrying memories that flared without warning. They had earned the right to play again, but they also had to learn how to live again. Football became a bridge between the world they left behind and the world they were trying to rediscover. The league owed them more than applause. It owed them the foundation of everything football would become. When returning veterans filled rosters in the late 1940s, attendance exploded. Every packed stadium echoed with gratitude for the players who had fought overseas. They did not ask for hero worship. Many of them could barely talk about their experiences. They simply lined up, snapped the ball, and played with the quiet resilience of men who understood perspective in ways their younger teammates could not yet fathom. But the league also owed recognition to the men who did not come back. Their absence reshaped franchises. It reshaped family histories. Some were star players, others were promising rookies. Some were college legends whose names had filled headlines before the war swept them away. Their stories rarely get the attention they deserve. No film can fully recreate the weight their parents carried. No highlight reel can show the unfinished seasons that would never be recorded. What remains are fragments. letters written from ships, portraits that hung in living rooms, handwritten messages to coaches promising they would return in the fall. They are reminders that history often moves forward by leaving countless personal chapters incomplete. When football honors military service today, it does so with ceremonies, uniforms, and patriotic displays. These gestures matter, yet they also risk simplifying the realities of the wartime generation. Their service was not a slogan. It was not an event celebrated during halftime. It was a lifetime of consequences. Some returned and built new careers. Some never regained full health. Some lived quietly with memories that haunted them long into old age. Their sacrifice cannot be confined to a single month of the season. It was written into the lives of the people who loved them, and the sport that still thrives because of them. The debt football owes extends beyond the players. It extends to the coaches who lost assistance to the war. It extends to the families who raised children without fathers. It extends to the communities that held fundraisers for wounded veterans who used to score touchdowns on Friday nights. Football was not just a game interrupted. It was a culture interrupted. Local rivalries were paused. College dynasties dissolved. High school traditions went silent for seasons at a time. When the sport returned, it carried the heavy awareness of what had been lost. That awareness helped create the emotional intensity that now defines football's identity. Every packed stadium, every roaring crowd, every heated rivalry exists partly because an earlier generation proved what the sport meant to them, even when they were far from home. Some people ask why we continue to tell these stories. The answer is simple. Because the game still carries their fingerprints. The toughness celebrated in football did not originate from weight rooms or modern training programs. It came from men who stepped onto battlefields without hesitation. The discipline that coaches preach traces back to veterans who brought military structure into locker rooms. The respect players show during moments of silence echoes the grief of families who lost their sons overseas. The league's eventual rise to national prominence was influenced by veterans whose names never reached national fame, but whose sacrifices allowed the sport to exist long enough to evolve. When I reflect on this wartime generation, I am reminded that memory is not just preservation, it is responsibility. It is the act of refusing to let time erode the human cost behind the statistics. The NFL grew into a national force in the post-war decades, but it did so on the shoulders of men who had carried their country through its darkest hour. Every future dynasty, every breakthrough season, every modern star is part of a lineage shaped by those who served. They deserve more than ceremonial recognition. They deserve to be remembered as the quiet architects of the sport's future. What we owe them is honesty. The honesty to acknowledge their sacrifices without romanticizing war. The honesty to celebrate their contributions without forgetting the pain that shaped them. The honesty to teach new generations that football's history is not only about yardage and championships, but about loss, recovery, and resilience. The game is richer because of them. Its story is deeper because of them. Its emotional gravity is anchored in the lives they lived and the lives they gave. What we owe them is gratitude. Gratitude not expressed through simple gestures, but through an enduring commitment to preserve their stories. Gratitude through education, remembrance, and reflection. Gratitude through understanding that football, for all its spectacle, carries a legacy built by men who faced realities far harsher than any stadium could contain. And finally, what we owe them is presence. The presence to pause before kickoff and think about the players who stood in uniforms of a different kind. The presence to imagine the silence in those wartime locker rooms. The presence to understand that the game we watch today exists only because they placed their futures on the line. Their legacy is not found in the standings. It is found in the strength of a sport that endured because they endured. It is found in the resilience of families that carried on when loved ones did not return. It is found in every moment when football reminds us that its heroes are not only defined by what they did on the field. This chapter is not a conclusion. It is a reminder. A reminder that the wartime generation of football players deserves a permanent place in the collective memory of the sport. Their stories must be told again and again. Their sacrifices must be honored with depth, sincerity, and understanding. They gave more than seasons. They gave years. They gave futures. They gave lives. Football can never repay that debt entirely, but it can remember. And that remembrance is the least the game can offer to the men who shaped its destiny. I've returned to the heart of this story, with the weight of everything we have uncovered still sitting heavy on my shoulders. When I first set out to retrace the impact of World War II on football, I expected numbers, dates, and headlines. I expected the surface-level narrative of a league disrupted by a global conflict. What I did not expect was the emotional depth of the lives intertwined between the white lines of the field and the front lines of the war. I did not expect the voices that still echo across decades, each carrying a mixture of pride, loss, resilience, and longing. This journey has not been about the statistics of wartime rosters or the wins and losses that were penciled into record books. It has been about the deeply human cost of a generation stolen before it had the chance to reach its full brilliance. As I reflect on the stories of the athletes who left the game behind, I find myself drawn to the idea of time itself. Time is the one resource that no soldier, no athlete, no family can ever reclaim once it is taken. The war took time from these men in a way that no opponent ever could. It took their early years, their prime years, and in too many cases, the years they never had the chance to live. Football careers are already short. The window of greatness closes fast. For these men, that window was torn away before they could even step fully through it. Every roster spot left empty. Every college star whose promise ended before draft day. Every minor injury that blossomed into a permanent wound because of battlefield trauma is part of a legacy that the sport still carries. I think about the players who returned and tried to find themselves in the game again. Some walked back into locker rooms that looked familiar but felt foreign. Their teammates had moved on. Their bodies had changed. Their minds had been rewired by the intensity of war. They struggled to rediscover the rhythm of a sport that once defined them. Some found healing, some found frustration. Some discovered that the game no longer fit the person they had become. Their presence on the field was a living reminder of what the war demanded, and what the league inherited when peace returned. They did not simply re-enter football. They transformed it. The NFL was still a young league when the conflict began. It was an underdog sport trying to define itself in a country dominated by baseball and college athletics. The war forced the league to adapt, to shrink, to improvise, and to endure. But more importantly, the war layered the sport with a deeper symbolic meaning. Football became more than competition. It became a mirror reflecting national unity, perseverance, and collective purpose. The returning veterans carried that sense of purpose into every snap. Crowds sensed it. Coaches sensed it. The growth of the league in the post-war years was not a coincidence. It was a direct extension of the emotional and cultural power that the wartime generation brought home with them. The legacy of that generation reaches far beyond the statistics recorded on paper. It shaped how the sport is played, coached, and understood. The discipline that veterans brought into coaching staffs changed training methods and expectations for decades. The emotional resilience they displayed influenced the ways teams bonded and supported one another. It is found in the way we tell their stories, the way we acknowledge the past, and the way we honor the human cost behind the evolution of the sport. We owe them truth. We owe them gratitude. We owe them the recognition that football's history is incomplete without their presence. Their legacy lives not only in the achievements of those who returned, but in the silence left by those who did not. In the quiet moments after a game, when the stadium empties and the noise fades, I sometimes imagine the footsteps of the players who never had the chance to walk off the field one last time. Their stories linger like a faint echo. Their dreams remain suspended in time. The sport they loved grew into something vast and powerful, but their names do not appear in the highlight montages or the award lists. Still, their impact endures. It endures in the toughness embedded in the culture of the game. It endures in the values passed down from veterans to rookies. It endures in the sense of unity that football strives to embody. The story of World War II and football is not simply a historical chapter. It is a reminder of the fragility of opportunity and the resilience of the human spirit. It is a testament to what was lost and what was rebuilt. It is a reflection of how deeply intertwined sports and society truly are. When we look at the modern landscape of football, we see the shadows of that generation everywhere. They live in the pride of the teams they once hoped to join. They live in the cheers of the crowds they never heard. They live in the game itself. As I close this journey, I find myself carrying the stories of these men with a renewed sense of responsibility. Their sacrifice deserves more than a passing acknowledgement. It deserves a permanent place in the narrative of the sport. Football owes its post-war rise to the strength, courage, and resilience of those who served, and the nation owes them a memory that does not fade. Their futures were stolen, but their legacy remains.